In 1943, Allied command discovered that certain military positions had a 90% fatality rate within the first week, yet thousands of men still volunteered. What could possibly make someone choose almost certain death? The year 1939 changed everything. One moment, families across Europe were planning summer vacations and worrying about everyday problems. The next moment, German tanks were rolling across the Polish border, and the world was plunging into the deadliest conflict in human history. World War II didn't just happen to soldiers in distant battlefields. It reached into every corner of life, transforming ordinary people into warriors, workers, and witnesses to unprecedented destruction. Within months, millions of young men were trading their civilian clothes for military uniforms, heading off to fight in places they'd never heard of before. But here's what most people don't realize about this war. It wasn't just bigger than previous conflicts, it was fundamentally different. The technology that emerged during these 6 years made every aspect of combat exponentially more lethal. Fighter planes could now fly faster than sound barriers, bombs could level entire city blocks in seconds, submarines prowled beneath the waves like invisible predators, striking without warning. Artillery shells grew massive enough to create craters the size of houses. Machine guns fired so rapidly they could cut down entire platoons in minutes. Tanks became rolling fortresses, yet somehow remained vulnerable to new anti-tank weapons that could pierce their armor like paper. Even the basic rifle carried by infantry soldiers had evolved into a precision killing machine compared to weapons from just 20 years earlier. The scale of mobilization was mind-boggling. Germany alone put over 17 million people into military service. The Soviet Union mobilized 34 million. The United States, despite entering the war later, eventually had over 16 million Americans in uniform. Britain, with its much smaller population, still managed to field nearly 6 million military personnel. These weren't just numbers on paper, these were real people leaving behind families, jobs, and normal lives. Then there's the industrial transformation that happened almost overnight. Factories that had been producing cars suddenly started churning out tanks. Companies making kitchen appliances switched to manufacturing ammunition. Women who had never worked outside their homes found themselves operating heavy machinery, welding ship hulls and assembling aircraft engines. The entire economic structure of participating nations shifted toward one goal: producing the tools of war. What made this conflict particularly brutal was how it blurred the traditional lines between combatants and civilians. Previous wars had been fought primarily between armies on designated battlefields. World War II brought the fight directly to people's doorsteps. Cities became targets. Civilians became strategic assets worth capturing or eliminating. The concept of a safe job or location essentially disappeared. Air raids could turn a peaceful neighborhood into rubble within hours. Submarine attacks meant that even merchant sailors delivering food and supplies faced the same deadly risks as frontline soldiers. Factory workers producing military equipment knew they were marked targets for enemy bombers. Even farmers weren't safe. Their crops fed armies, making agricultural areas legitimate military objectives. The psychological impact was equally devastating. Radio broadcasts brought news of distant battles directly into people's living rooms. Families waited anxiously for letters from sons, fathers, and brothers serving overseas, knowing that weeks could pass between communications. A knock on the door from military officials could mean devastating news about loved ones. Communication technology, while primitive by today's standards, was advanced enough to make this the first truly global war that people could follow in near real time. Newspapers printed daily casualty reports. Radio announcers delivered updates on major battles. Propaganda films showed both victories and defeats, though governments carefully controlled which images reached the public. Geographic boundaries meant nothing anymore. Battles raged across 6 continents. Pacific islands that most people couldn't locate on a map became household names after bloody amphibious assaults. Desert campaigns in North Africa determined the fate of entire nations. The frozen landscapes of Eastern Europe witnessed some of the largest tank battles in history. Supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, creating entirely new categories of military jobs. Convoy escort duties, submarine hunting, and long-range reconnaissance missions put sailors at sea for months at a time. Pilots flew supply runs over mountain ranges and hostile territory, often in weather conditions that would ground aircraft today. Medical advances were desperately needed, because the weapons technology was advancing faster than protective equipment. Body armor was primitive or non-existent for most soldiers. Medical evacuation procedures were crude compared to modern standards. A wound that would be easily treatable today could mean death within hours during World War II. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this global conflict was how it created entirely new categories of extremely dangerous jobs. Positions that hadn't existed in previous wars suddenly became essential and deadly. These weren't traditional combat roles where soldiers faced each other across battle lines. Some of these jobs had survival rates that would shock you. Others required skills and courage that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. The bomber crews flying over Europe, for instance, would soon discover just how thin the line between life and death could become when you're trapped in a metal tube, surrounded by enemy fighters, with nowhere to run. When those massive bombers lifted off the runway, their crews knew the math wasn't in their favor. Each mission meant a coin flip with death. Heads, you come home. Tails, well, your family gets a telegram. The US 8th Air Force, stationed in England, faced some of the most brutal statistics of the entire war. Out of every 100 bomber crew members who started their tour of duty, only about 20 would finish it alive and unwounded. That's an 80% casualty rate. Your high school algebra class had better survival odds than a B-17 Flying Fortress crew. These weren't quick deaths either. Bomber crews faced a deadly cocktail of threats that could kill them in dozens of different ways. German fighter planes would swarm the formations like angry wasps, their machine guns and cannons tearing through aluminum skin as if it were paper. Then there were the flak fields, massive walls of exploding anti-aircraft shells that turned the sky into a minefield of hot metal fragments. But the really twisted part, the bombers had to fly straight and level during their bomb runs. No evasive maneuvers, no fancy flying. Just hold steady while every German gun in the area tried to blow you out of the sky. It was like standing perfectly still in a shooting gallery while someone took target practice with your life. Weather became another silent killer above the clouds. Ice would form on the wings and instruments, sending planes into deadly spins. Fog could separate formations, leaving lone bombers as easy prey for fighters. Winter missions over Europe meant flying at altitudes where the temperature dropped to 50 degrees below zero. Crew members literally froze to death at their positions. The bombers themselves weren't exactly flying tanks either. Despite nicknames like Flying Fortress, these planes were built for carrying bombs, not surviving punishment. A single well-placed cannon shell could sever control cables, knock out engines, or start fires that would consume the entire aircraft in minutes. Let's talk about those fires for a moment. Aviation fuel and oxygen systems don't mix well with hot metal fragments. When a bomber caught fire, crew members had perhaps 30 seconds to bail out before the whole thing turned into a falling torch. Many never got the chance. They stayed at their posts, trying desperately to keep the plane flying long enough for their buddies to escape. Then there's the psychological warfare aspect that nobody talks about much. German fighters would sometimes hold back, letting the bombers think they were safe, before launching coordinated attacks from multiple directions. The waiting became almost as brutal as the actual combat. Crews would scan the empty sky, knowing that somewhere out there, enemy pilots were planning their deaths. Some bomber groups lost entire squadrons in single missions. The 100th Bomb Group earned the nickname Bloody 100th because they seemed to attract every German fighter in the sky. Their losses were so severe that veteran crews would joke grimly about being transferred there, if you could still call it joking when everyone knew it might be a death sentence. Radio chatter during missions told the real story. Crew members would call out fighter attacks, report casualties, and sometimes just scream as their planes broke apart around them. The lucky ones died quickly. Others rode burning aircraft down for thousands of feet, trapped by damaged escape hatches or unconscious from wounds. Military planners originally set the magic number at 25 missions. Complete 25 bombing runs, and you could go home. Sounds reasonable, right? Well, mathematicians calculated that with the loss rates they were seeing, less than 25% of crews would live long enough to reach that goal. They later raised it to 35 missions, which made the odds even worse. Yet these crews kept flying. Day after day, they climbed into those aluminum coffins and headed for Germany. Some developed elaborate pre-flight rituals, or lucky charms. Others wrote letters home before every mission, just in case. A few went quietly insane from the stress, but still showed up for duty. The really heartbreaking part was how young most of these airmen were. Many hadn't even reached their 20th birthday. They'd signed up to be heroes, and instead found themselves in a deadly lottery, where the house always won eventually. Despite all this, bomber crews played a crucial role in winning the war. Their missions crippled German industry, destroyed fuel supplies, and forced the enemy to divert precious resources to air defense. But that strategic importance came at a staggering human cost. Of course, not every position on those bombers carried the same risk. Some crew members had slightly better chances of survival than others. The tail gunners and radio operators at least had some space to move around. But there was one job on those flying death traps that made even veteran airmen shake their heads in sympathy. A position so dangerous that flying bombers was already a death sentence. But some crew members had it even worse than others. Way worse. Meet the ball turret gunner, the guy who crawled into a tiny glass bubble hanging underneath the bomber. This wasn't just any job. This was like volunteering to be target practice while trapped in a fishbowl. The ball turret looked exactly like what it sounds like. A sphere made mostly of glass and metal, barely big enough for one person. Gunners had to curl up in the fetal position, just to fit inside. Their knees practically touched their chin. The whole thing was about as roomy as a phone booth, except phone booths don't dangle from flying planes while people shoot at them. Here's where it gets really bad. The ball turret hung from the belly of the bomber, completely exposed. No thick armor plating like other gun positions. No solid metal walls to hide behind. Just thin sheets of glass and metal that could barely stop a strong wind, let alone enemy bullets. German fighter pilots knew this weakness. They specifically targeted ball turret gunners because they were sitting ducks, literally hanging ducks. Fighter planes would swoop in from below and rake the belly of the bomber with machine gun fire. The ball turret took the worst of it every single time. Then there's the parachute problem. Most ball turret gunners couldn't wear parachutes while operating their guns. The space was too cramped. Their parachutes had to be stored elsewhere in the plane, so when the bomber got hit and started going down, the gunner had to somehow crawl out of his turret, find his parachute, strap it on, and jump, all while the plane was spinning toward Earth. Many never made it out in time. The turret itself weighed about 1,000 pounds and was powered by electricity. When the plane lost power, the turret couldn't rotate. Gunners got stuck in whatever position they were in when the lights went out. Sometimes upside down, sometimes sideways, always helpless. Ball turret gunners also faced a uniquely terrifying problem during landing. If the bomber's landing gear got damaged, the plane would have to land on its belly. That meant landing directly on top of the ball turret. With the gunner still inside, crews would frantically try to crank the turret up by hand, but manual operation took forever. Some gunners were crushed during belly landings because they couldn't get out in time. The cold was another killer. At 25,000 feet, temperatures dropped to -60 degrees Fahrenheit. The ball turret had no heating system. Gunners wore electrically heated suits, but when those failed, and they often did, frostbite set in fast. Some gunners lost fingers, toes, or worse to the cold. But wait, it gets even more brutal. The ball turret offered a perfect view of everything happening during combat. Gunners could see other bombers getting shot down. They watched crew members falling without parachutes. They saw fighter planes coming straight at them with guns blazing. The psychological damage was massive. Enemy flak, those exploding anti-aircraft shells, created another nightmare scenario. Flak could shatter the turret's glass without warning. Sharp fragments would tear through the cramped space like shrapnel grenades. Many gunners bled to death while trapped in their glass coffins. Some ball turret gunners developed severe claustrophobia. Makes sense, right? Spending hours crammed in a tiny space while people actively try to kill you would mess with anyone's head. But there was no escape, no sick days, no transfers to safer positions. Once you were assigned to the ball turret, that was your job until you completed your tour of duty, or died. Whichever came first, the survival statistics were absolutely brutal. Most ball turret gunners didn't survive their full tour of 25 missions. The lucky ones got wounded badly enough to be sent home early. The unlucky ones never came home at all. Well, here's the thing that made it even worse. The ball turret required the smallest crew members. Air forces specifically chose short, lightweight men for these positions. Many were teenagers, barely out of high school. Young kids, who should have been worried about homework and dates instead, found themselves dangling from bombers over Nazi Germany. Training for ball turret gunners was rushed and basic. There wasn't time for extensive preparation. New gunners learned on the job, which meant their first few missions were basically live fire training exercises against professional enemy pilots who had been fighting for years. The cramped conditions also made it nearly impossible to treat wounds during flight. If a ball turret gunner got hit, he was usually stuck there until the plane landed. Medical help couldn't reach him. Sometimes crew members found their gunner had bled to death during the flight home. But the terror didn't end with bomber crews. Other jobs in World War II carried their own special kinds of death sentences. Submarine crews, for instance, faced an entirely different type of underwater nightmare that made even ball turret duty look appealing. When bomber crews faced death from above, submariners were dealing with something entirely different: death from all directions while trapped in a steel tube hundreds of feet underwater. The submarine service attracted some of the bravest men of World War II. But bravery alone couldn't save most of them from one of the war's deadliest statistics. German U-boat crews faced the worst odds of anyone in the entire war. Over 75% of them never made it home. That's 3 out of every 4 men who climbed down into those cramped submarines and never saw sunlight again. The German Navy started the war with about 40,000 submarine crew members. By 1945, roughly 30,000 of them were dead. These weren't just numbers. They were fathers, brothers and sons who volunteered for what became floating coffins. Life aboard a submarine meant weeks of terror punctuated by moments of pure panic. U-boats could stay underwater for only limited periods before their batteries died and air ran out. Imagine being stuck in a metal cylinder the size of a large house with 50 other sweaty, unwashed men. No showers, no fresh air, and the constant knowledge that enemy ships were actively hunting you with depth charges, underwater bombs designed to crack your hull like an eggshell. The hunting worked both ways though. Submarines were incredibly effective killers when they worked properly. A single torpedo could sink a massive cargo ship in minutes, sending hundreds of tons of supplies and dozens of crew members straight to the ocean floor. German U-boats sank over 3,500 Allied ships during the war, but this success came at an almost unimaginable price. Then there's the psychological warfare that came with submarine duty. Silent running meant the entire crew had to stay completely quiet for hours or even days. One dropped wrench or loud cough could give away their position to enemy sonar. Men whispered when they had to communicate at all. They moved like ghosts through their own ship, knowing that the slightest sound might bring depth charges raining down from above. Speaking of depth charges, surviving one of these attacks was largely a matter of luck. These underwater explosives didn't need to hit a submarine directly to destroy it. The pressure waves from a nearby explosion could crack the hull, flood compartments or knock out critical systems. Submarine crews described depth charge attacks as being inside a bell while someone hammered on it with a sledgehammer. The noise was deafening, the ship shook violently, and everyone knew that the next explosion might be the last thing they ever heard. What made submarine warfare particularly terrifying was how quickly everything could go wrong. A torpedo attack might take 30 seconds from launch to impact, but a submarine under attack had nowhere to run. Unlike pilots who could bail out or soldiers who could retreat, submariners were trapped inside their vessel. When a submarine started flooding, crew members in different compartments often had to seal doors to save the ship, knowing they were condemning their friends on the other side to certain death. The technology meant to save them sometimes made things worse. Early submarine escape equipment was primitive and often useless. Even if crew members could get out of a sinking submarine, they faced the challenge of reaching the surface from depths of several hundred feet. The pressure change alone could kill them, and that's assuming they didn't drown first or get swept away by ocean currents. Allied submarines faced similar dangers, though their casualty rates were somewhat better than their German counterparts. American submarine crews in the Pacific had a death rate of about 22%, still incredibly high compared to most other military jobs, but nothing like the massacre happening in German U-boats. The difference came down to resources, training, and increasingly sophisticated anti-submarine technology that the Allies developed as the war progressed. Life support systems on submarines were another constant threat. Carbon dioxide could build up to lethal levels if the scrubbing equipment failed. Oxygen could run dangerously low during extended underwater periods. Men sometimes passed out at their stations, and crew members regularly developed headaches and nausea from breathing recycled air for days at a time. The cramped conditions meant that injuries were common, and medical care was limited. Submarine crews couldn't call for medical evacuation or visit a field hospital. The best they could hope for was basic first aid from a crew member with minimal medical training. Serious injuries or illnesses often meant death, even from conditions that would be easily treatable on land. But the real nightmare scenario that every submariner feared was being detected while submerged. Enemy destroyers would circle overhead, dropping depth charges in systematic patterns, trying to crack the submarine open like a nut. These attacks could last for hours, with explosions getting closer and closer as the enemy ships refined their targeting. The psychological pressure of submarine warfare was so intense that many crew members developed what doctors would now recognize as severe PTSD. though at the time it was just called battle fatigue. But even the strongest minds could crack under the constant stress of underwater warfare, especially when facing odds that made survival seem almost impossible. Yet somehow, despite these horrific conditions, some submariners managed to survive multiple patrols and even complete their tours of duty. These survivors would soon discover that other jobs in the war carried their own unique forms of death, some of them involving even smaller spaces and less protection than submarines could offer. While bomber crews faced death from above and submariners fought their battles beneath the waves, another group of sailors tackled a completely different kind of underwater threat. These weren't hunting enemy vessels or dropping bombs on cities. Instead, they were hunting something far more sinister and much harder to see. Naval minesweepers had arguably one of the most nerve-wracking jobs in the entire war. Their mission, find and destroy sea mines before those mines found them first. Sounds simple enough, right? Well, the reality was absolutely terrifying. Sea mines were basically underwater bombs waiting for any ship to bump into them. The Germans alone dropped over 43,000 mines in British waters during the war. These weren't just random explosives either. Engineers designed them to be as deadly and sneaky as possible. Some floated just below the surface, invisible until the last second. Others sat on the ocean floor, triggered by the magnetic pull of a ship's metal hull passing overhead. Then there were the truly nasty ones. Acoustic mines that exploded when they heard a ship's engine. Pressure mines that detonated when a vessel's weight pushed down on the water above them. The Germans even created mines with multiple triggers, just in case one system failed. Talk about overkill. Minesweeper crews faced a daily game of deadly hide-and-seek. Every morning they'd sail out into waters that could literally blow them to pieces without warning. Their ships weren't heavily armored warships built to take hits. Most minesweepers were converted fishing boats, civilian vessels, or hastily built naval craft. If a mine exploded near them, the thin hull would crack like an eggshell. The work itself was exhausting and incredibly stressful. Crews would drag massive steel cables behind their ships, hoping to snag mine cables and detonate the explosives safely away from the vessel. But mines didn't always cooperate. Sometimes the cables would snap, sometimes mines would drift closer to the ship than expected, and sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, a mine would explode right next to the minesweeper. British minesweeper HMS Lydd learned this lesson the hard way in 1940. While clearing mines off the English coast, the ship hit a German mine that detonated directly underneath the hull. The explosion was so powerful it literally broke the ship in half. 49 crew members died instantly, and the vessel sank in minutes. The few survivors were pulled from freezing water, many with severe injuries from the blast. What made this job even more dangerous was the sheer number of mines scattered across the world's oceans. The English Channel became known as mine soup because of the thousands of explosives floating in the water. Ships trying to reach British ports had to navigate carefully planned routes, but even these safe corridors weren't guaranteed to be mine-free. Minesweeper crews worked in shifts around the clock, knowing that every sweep of their detection equipment could be their last. The stress was incredible. Imagine trying to concentrate on delicate technical work while knowing that one mistake could vaporize you and your entire crew in a split second. Many sailors developed what they called mine nerves, a constant state of anxiety that made sleep nearly impossible. The casualty rates tell the whole story. British minesweepers lost over 2,600 men during the war. American minesweeper crews suffered similar losses in the Pacific, where Japanese mines claimed dozens of vessels. The Soviet Navy lost entire minesweeping flotillas to German mine barriers in the Baltic Sea. But here's the really cruel part. Even when minesweepers successfully cleared an area, new mines could drift in with the tides or be dropped by enemy aircraft the very next night. Crews might risk their lives clearing a shipping lane, only to have it become deadly again within hours. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. Some of the worst accidents happened when mines exploded in chain reactions. One mine detonating could trigger others nearby, creating massive underwater explosions that could sink multiple ships at once. In 1943, a German mine barrier in the Mediterranean caused a chain reaction that destroyed 3 Allied minesweepers in less than 10 minutes. The psychological toll was enormous. Minesweeper crews knew they were essentially playing Russian roulette every time they went to sea. Unlike bomber crews who could shoot back at enemy fighters, or submarine crews who could dive deep to escape attack, minesweepers had no real defense against their enemy. They couldn't shoot mines, they couldn't outrun them. All they could do was hope their detection equipment worked properly, and pray they spotted the deadly devices before it was too late. Yet these brave crews kept sailing out day after day, clearing the sea lanes that kept supplies flowing to Allied forces around the world. Their work was absolutely essential for the war effort, even though most people never heard their names or learned their stories. Speaking of unsung heroes who faced instant death with every step they took, there was another group dealing with explosive threats in an entirely different environment. After the dust settled from massive battles and armies moved on, someone still had to clean up the deadly mess left behind. Retreating forces didn't just abandon their positions, they booby-trapped everything and scattered millions of hidden mines across the landscape. Enter the demoners, men who volunteered to walk straight into fields of death with nothing but primitive metal detectors and nerves of steel. The job sounds straightforward enough. Find the mine, mark it, defuse it, move on. But here's the thing about landmines. They were designed by engineers whose only goal was killing people as efficiently as possible. German S-mines, nicknamed Bouncing Bettys, would leap 3 feet into the air before exploding, shredding everything within 30 yards. Soviet PMD-6 mines were made mostly of wood, making them nearly impossible to detect with metal detectors. The infamous shoe mine contained just enough explosive to blow off a foot, leaving the victim alive but permanently crippled. Demoners worked with equipment that would make today's bomb disposal experts laugh. Early metal detectors were massive, unreliable contraptions that beeped at everything from belt buckles to bottle caps. Many demoners preferred using thin metal rods, poking the ground inch by inch, hoping to feel the resistance of a mine casing before applying enough pressure to trigger it. One slight miscalculation meant instant death or life as a multiple amputee. But wait, it gets worse. Armies didn't just plant mines randomly. They created intricate patterns designed to funnel enemies into kill zones. Anti-personnel mines were often clustered around anti-tank mines, so when demoners found the big ones, smaller mines waited nearby to eliminate the disposal teams. Some mines were connected by tripwires to others dozens of yards away. Clear one mine successfully, and 3 more might detonate simultaneously. Weather made everything more dangerous. Rain could wash away the subtle visual clues that revealed mine locations, while also making the ground softer and more likely to trigger pressure-sensitive devices. Snow covered everything, turning minefields into deadly guessing games. Heat caused metal components to expand, sometimes making stable mines unstable. Cold weather made the demoners' hands shake, and shaking hands don't mix well with delicate explosive devices. The psychological pressure was relentless. Every step could be your last. Every sweep of the metal detector might reveal another instrument of death. Deminers developed superstitions and rituals, wearing lucky charms or following precise routines before entering contaminated areas. Some talked constantly to their partners to stay calm. Others worked in complete silence, believing conversation was a fatal distraction. Then there were the booby traps hidden among the mines. Retreating German forces became masters of deadly improvisation, rigging explosives to door handles, light switches, even teddy bears left in abandoned houses. Deminers learned to suspect everything and touch nothing without careful examination. A beautiful piano in an empty farmhouse might have grenades wired to the keys. A family photograph could hide a pressure plate that would bring down the entire building. The casualty rates tell the real story. British mine clearance teams in North Africa suffered losses approaching 40%. Soviet demining battalions, often staffed with former prisoners and political undesirables, had survival rates so low that assignment to these units was essentially a death sentence. American explosive ordnance disposal teams fared slightly better, but only because they had superior equipment and training. What made the job even more heartbreaking was knowing that mines don't distinguish between soldiers and civilians. After the war ended, French farmers would discover mines while plowing their fields. Italian children playing in bombed-out buildings would trigger devices left behind months earlier. Deminers weren't just clearing military obstacles, they were trying to make the world safe for normal life again. Some deminers developed an almost supernatural ability to sense danger. Experienced operators claimed they could smell certain types of explosives or feel the subtle changes in ground density that indicated buried devices. Whether this was real skill or survivor bias, these veteran deminers became invaluable team leaders, teaching newcomers the thousands of tiny details that meant the difference between going home and going to the morgue. The tools improved slowly. Better metal detectors appeared, then primitive X-ray machines that could peer into suspicious objects without moving them. Remote-controlled robots began handling the most dangerous devices, but for most of the war and the immediate aftermath, demining remained a job for brave people with steady hands and strong stomachs. Even today, Unexploded ordnance from World War II still kills people. Construction workers in London regularly uncover massive bombs dropped during the Blitz. French farmers still plow up artillery shells from both world wars. The work of wartime deminers may have saved thousands of lives, but they couldn't find everything. Speaking of dangerous construction work, combat engineers had an even more challenging assignment. They had to build things while people were actively shooting at them. Building bridges while people shoot at you sounds like the world's worst construction job. Combat engineers during World War II faced exactly this nightmare every single day. They weren't just builders, they were builders who worked under enemy fire, cleared deadly minefields, and blew things up for a living. These weren't your average hard-hat workers. Combat engineers had to construct vital bridges, roads, and fortifications while machine gun bullets whizzed past their heads. The enemy knew exactly what they were doing too. Destroy the engineers, and you stop the entire army from moving forward. Makes sense, right? The job description was simple but terrifying. Build what your army needs and destroy what the enemy needs. In practice, this meant crawling through minefields with basic metal detectors, setting explosive charges on enemy bunkers, and constructing pontoon bridges while artillery shells exploded around them. The mortality rate among combat engineers was staggering, nearly as high as frontline infantry soldiers. Let's not forget the bridges themselves. Engineers often worked at night, trying to stay hidden from enemy spotters. They'd wade into freezing rivers, carrying heavy steel beams and wooden planks. The work was backbreaking even without people shooting at them. Add enemy snipers picking off workers one by one, and you've got a job that made regular soldiers grateful for their foxholes. Then there's the demolition work. Combat engineers became experts with explosives, but not the safe, controlled kind used in peacetime. They planted charges on enemy bridges, buildings and defensive positions while under fire. One miscalculation, one stray bullet hitting their explosives, and the entire team would disappear in a cloud of smoke. Many engineers carried enough TNT to level a city block, and they knew it. The weird part is how essential their work was. Without combat engineers, entire offensives would grind to a halt. Tanks couldn't cross rivers without bridges. Infantry couldn't advance through minefields without clearance. Artillery couldn't move forward without proper roads. Every major battle success depended on these men doing impossible jobs under impossible conditions. But why were they such prime targets? Enemy commanders understood that killing engineers was like cutting the supply lines of an entire army. A single well-placed sniper could delay thousands of troops for hours or even days. German forces specifically targeted engineer units, knowing that stopping them meant stopping entire divisions from advancing. Combat engineers also faced the psychological horror of working with mines. German engineers had planted millions of anti-personnel and anti-tank mines across Europe. Allied engineers had to find and disarm these deadly devices, often by crawling on their stomachs and probing the ground inch by inch with bayonets. One wrong move, one mine they missed, and their buddies behind them would pay the price. The Eastern Front was particularly brutal for engineers. Soviet and German engineers worked in temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. They built bridges over frozen rivers while fighting frostbite and enemy attacks simultaneously. Many engineers lost fingers to frostbite before they ever faced enemy fire. The cold made their metal tools burn their hands, but they couldn't wear thick gloves and still handle delicate explosive work. Well, the survival tricks these men developed were extraordinary. They learned to work in complete darkness, identifying tools and materials by touch alone. They developed hand signals for silent communication while placing explosives. Some teams could build entire bridges without speaking a word, communicating only through taps and gestures. And the weird part is how creative they became under pressure. Engineers improvised bridges from destroyed tanks, used enemy ammunition to blow up enemy positions, and turned bombed buildings into defensive fortifications. They became masters of making something from nothing while bullets flew around them. The Pacific Theater brought unique challenges. Engineers had to clear Japanese bunkers carved into solid rock, often requiring massive amounts of explosives. They built runways on tiny islands while under constant attack from hidden Japanese positions. The jungle humidity made their equipment rust and their explosives unreliable, adding another layer of danger to an already deadly job. Then there is the aftermath of their work. Many combat engineer units suffered casualty rates exceeding 70% during major campaigns. The survivors often dealt with permanent hearing loss from constant explosions, missing limbs from mine accidents, and psychological trauma from watching their teammates die in horrific ways. Combat engineers saved thousands of lives by clearing safe passages for infantry and building vital supply routes. But they paid a terrible price for their crucial work. Every bridge they built, every mine they cleared, and every enemy position they destroyed came at the cost of their own safety and often their lives. Of course, engineers weren't the only ones fighting deadly battles in complete darkness. Night fighter pilots faced their own unique horrors, hunting enemy bombers through pitch-black skies where a single mistake meant certain death. When daylight faded and cities went dark, a special breed of pilot took to the skies. Night fighters had one job: hunt down enemy bombers before they could destroy their targets. Sounds straightforward. Well, flying a fighter plane in complete darkness turned out to be one of the war's most dangerous assignments. The biggest enemy wasn't always the bombers they chased. It was the darkness itself. Pilots couldn't see their instruments clearly, couldn't spot landmarks, and definitely couldn't tell which direction was up or down once they got disoriented. Many experienced pilots who survived dozens of daylight missions died simply because they flew their planes straight into the ground while chasing shadows. Navigation became a nightmare when the sun went down. Radio beacons helped, but enemy jamming often made them useless. Pilots had to rely on dead reckoning and pure guesswork to find their way home. Getting lost meant flying around in circles until the fuel ran out. Then came the terrifying choice: bail out over unknown territory or try a blind landing in pitch darkness. Anti-aircraft fire posed an even deadlier threat at night. Ground gunners couldn't tell friend from enemy in the darkness, so they shot at everything that moved. Allied night fighters faced almost as much danger from their own side's guns as from enemy aircraft. The irony was brutal. Pilots survived dogfights with enemy bombers only to get blown apart by friendly fire while heading home. Early radar systems promised to solve the night fighting problem, but the technology barely worked. The primitive equipment broke down constantly and gave false readings that sent pilots chasing ghosts across empty sky. When radar did work, it couldn't distinguish between enemy bombers and Allied fighters returning from missions. This led to tragic cases of Allied pilots shooting down their own squad mates by mistake. German night fighters developed some of the war's most innovative tactics. They installed upward-firing cannons that could attack bombers from below, where gunners couldn't see them coming. But this same innovation made their planes heavier and harder to control in darkness. Many German aces who mastered these techniques died when their modified aircraft became unmanageable during bad weather. The psychological pressure of night fighting pushed many pilots to their breaking point. Flying blind for hours while hunting deadly enemies created a special kind of stress that daylight pilots never experienced. Some developed what doctors called night blindness anxiety, a condition where pilots became so afraid of losing their vision that they couldn't function effectively in darkness. Weather turned night missions into suicide runs. Clouds looked exactly like enemy aircraft on primitive radar screens. Storm fronts appeared and disappeared without warning, sending fighters into violent turbulence that could rip wings off. Ice formation on windscreens made visibility even worse, forcing pilots to fly by instruments they could barely read. British night fighter pilots faced unique challenges during the Blitz. They had to intercept German bombers over their own cities while avoiding hitting buildings, church spires and radio towers. Flying low enough to spot enemy aircraft meant risking collision with structures that weren't marked on any map. Many pilots knew they were flying over their own neighborhoods, adding emotional pressure to an already impossible job. Fuel management became a life-or-death calculation every single night. Chasing enemy bombers across hundreds of miles of darkness burned through fuel reserves quickly. Pilots had to choose between pursuing their targets and saving enough fuel to make it home. Running out of gas over enemy territory meant certain capture or death. Mid-air collisions happened far more often in night fighting than during daylight missions. Two aircraft approaching each other at combined speeds of 600 miles per hour had virtually no chance of seeing each other until impact. Even experienced pilots with sharp eyesight couldn't spot another plane more than a few hundred yards away in moonless conditions. The most successful night fighters developed almost supernatural senses. They learned to spot engine exhausts glowing faintly in darkness and hear the subtle differences between friendly and enemy aircraft engines. These skills took months to develop, but most pilots didn't survive long enough to master them. Training for night fighting was nearly as dangerous as actual combat. Practice flights in darkness led to countless crashes as student pilots learned the hard way that normal flying rules didn't apply after sunset. Flight schools lost almost as many planes during night training as they did in actual combat operations. Then there were the technical failures that turned routine patrols into death traps. Engine problems that would be manageable during daylight became catastrophic at night. Electrical failures knocked out instrument lights, leaving pilots flying blind in more ways than one. Radio malfunctions cut off communication with ground controllers who might have guided them to safety. But the strangest danger came from something no one expected. Night fighters sometimes became so focused on hunting enemy aircraft that they forgot to monitor their own altitude and speed. Several experienced pilots flew perfectly good aircraft straight into the ocean while chasing bomber formations that turned out to be flocks of migrating birds. Of course, night fighting was just one of many specialized roles that pushed human endurance to its limits. Other jobs required getting uncomfortably close to enemy positions, often with nothing but binoculars and a radio for protection. While most soldiers fought in units with backup nearby, some had jobs that put them completely alone in the most dangerous places imaginable. Forward observers were the eyes of the artillery, and their work meant crawling closer to enemy lines than anyone else dared to go. They spotted targets, called in strikes, and watched the destruction they helped create. The problem? They had to get close enough to see everything clearly, which meant getting close enough to die. These weren't your average soldiers hiding in trenches with their buddies. Forward observers worked in tiny teams, sometimes just 2 or 3 men, creeping through no man's land with nothing but binoculars, a radio, and nerves of steel. Their job was simple to explain but terrifying to do. Get close enough to enemy positions to see what needed bombing, then stay alive long enough to guide the artillery shells to their targets. The math was brutal. Artillery could hit targets from miles away, but only if someone told them exactly where to aim. Maps weren't good enough. Guesswork wasted shells and got friendly troops killed. Someone had to eyeball the target, measure distances, and radio back precise coordinates. That someone was usually lying in a muddy hole just a few hundred yards from enemy machine guns. Radio equipment in World War II wasn't like today's tiny devices. These radios were heavy, awkward boxes that required long antennas and clear signals. Setting up meant staying in one spot long enough to get a good connection, which also meant staying in one spot long enough for enemy snipers to figure out where you were. The bright metal antenna was basically a shoot here. Sign visible from a distance, then there's the waiting. Forward observers didn't just call in one quick strike and leave. They had to watch where the shells landed, calculate adjustments, and keep calling in corrections until the target was destroyed. A single mission could take hours. Hours of lying perfectly still while enemy patrols searched nearby. Hours of whispering coordinates into a radio while bullets cracked overhead. German and Japanese forces knew exactly how valuable these spotters were. Capturing a forward observer meant learning where the next artillery strike would fall. Killing one meant blinding the enemy's big guns. Both sides trained snipers specifically to hunt for the telltale signs of observer teams. The glint of binoculars, the thin line of an antenna, or the brief flash of a map being checked. Weather made everything worse. Rain turned hiding spots into muddy pits and made radio signals weaker. Snow meant leaving footprints that led straight to your position. Hot weather meant carrying extra water, which meant more weight and more noise. Night missions required special skills and equipment most observers didn't have. The psychological pressure was enormous. These men knew that one wrong radio call could drop artillery shells on their own troops. They also knew that missing an important target could let enemy reinforcements slip through. Every decision carried life or death consequences for hundreds of soldiers they'd never even meet. Some forward observers developed incredible skills. Veterans learned to estimate distances just by looking, calculate wind effects on falling shells, and predict where enemy forces would move next. The best ones could call in pinpoint strikes that hit targets smaller than a house from miles away. But becoming that skilled meant surviving long enough to learn, and most observers didn't get that chance. American forces lost forward observers at rates comparable to fighter pilots. Soviet observers on the Eastern Front faced even worse odds, often working without proper radio equipment or backup plans. Japanese observers in the Pacific had to deal with jungle conditions that made radio communication nearly impossible. The strange thing is how much these men influenced major battles without anyone knowing their names. A skilled observer team could stop an entire enemy tank advance by calling in perfectly placed artillery strikes. They could break up infantry attacks before they reached friendly lines. Some historians argue that forward observers prevented more casualties than any other single job in the war. Equipment failures were a constant threat. Dead radio batteries meant no way to call for help or redirect artillery. Broken binoculars meant guessing at distances and targets. Damaged maps meant getting lost in enemy territory with no way to find friendly lines again. But the real nightmare was being discovered. Enemy forces didn't just shoot forward observers, they hunted them. Special teams would track radio signals, follow footprints and search likely hiding spots. Getting caught usually meant torture to extract information about upcoming attacks, then execution. The job attracted a specific type of soldier, men who could stay calm under pressure, think clearly while exhausted, and make split-second decisions that affected entire battles. They worked alone but carried the lives of thousands on their shoulders. While forward observers crept through enemy territory with radios and binoculars, another group of soldiers prepared for a completely different kind of suicide mission. These men would jump from perfectly good airplanes into hostile territory with nothing but parachutes and whatever weapons they could carry. When an aeroplane door opens at 1,200 feet and you're supposed to jump out on purpose, something's probably gone terribly wrong with military strategy. But that's exactly what paratroopers did thousands of times during World War II. These guys literally threw themselves out of perfectly good aircraft into enemy territory, armed with little more than a rifle and whatever prayers they could muster during the fall. The concept sounds insane when you break it down. Step 1. Stuff a bunch of soldiers into a slow-moving transport plane. Step 2. Fly that plane directly over enemy positions while getting shot at. Step 3. Have everyone jump out and hope for the best. It's like the world's deadliest game of trust fall, except nobody's catching you and everyone below wants you dead. Paratroopers faced death from the moment they stepped into their aircraft. Transport planes were sitting ducks for enemy fighters. These lumbering giants couldn't outrun or outmaneuver anyone. They just had to lumber along at low altitude, hoping to reach the drop zone before getting blown out of the sky. Many paratroopers died before they ever got the chance to jump. Then came the jump itself. Ever tried threading a needle while riding a roller coaster during an earthquake? That's roughly how precise these drops were supposed to be. Wind could scatter troops across miles of countryside. Bad weather turned organized military operations into deadly games of hide and seek. Some paratroopers landed in trees, dangling helplessly while enemy soldiers used them for target practice. Others hit buildings, power lines, or water deep enough to drown in with all their heavy gear. The lucky ones who actually landed where they were supposed to still faced a nightmare scenario. Picture this: you've just parachuted behind enemy lines, probably separated from most of your unit, carrying limited ammunition and supplies. Everyone around you speaks a different language and wants to kill you. Your backup plan? There isn't one. Extraction wasn't happening anytime soon. Equipment failures turned deadly fast. Parachutes didn't always open. When they did, the landing could still break bones or knock you unconscious. Many paratroopers hit the ground so hard they couldn't fight effectively even if they wanted to. Others got tangled in their chutes and became easy targets while struggling to free themselves. But the real terror started after landing. Paratroopers often couldn't find their units in the chaos. They wandered through unfamiliar territory, trying to complete missions with incomplete information and dwindling supplies. Enemy patrols hunted them constantly. Local civilians might help or might turn them in for rewards. There was no way to tell friend from foe until it was often too late. The D-Day invasion showcased both the bravery and the brutal reality of airborne operations. Thousands of Allied paratroopers jumped into Normandy before the beach landings began. Many missed their drop zones by miles. Some landed in flooded areas and drowned. Others faced immediate counterattacks from German forces who knew exactly where they'd landed. Well, here's the twisted part about paratrooper mathematics. Mission success often depended on acceptable losses. Military planners calculated that losing 30 to 50% of an airborne unit was worth it if the survivors could complete their objectives. These weren't faceless statistics to the guys jumping out of planes. They knew the odds going in. German paratroopers faced similar horrors, especially during their invasion of Crete in 1941. They suffered such massive casualties that Hitler largely abandoned large-scale airborne operations afterward. The survivors described landing in a meat grinder, with defenders shooting them while they were still in their parachutes. Makes sense, right? When your enemy literally falls from the sky, they're pretty hard to miss. Japanese paratroopers had their own special brand of nightmare, often operating with even less support and supplies than their Western counterparts. They frequently faced situations where surrender wasn't culturally acceptable, but survival was mathematically impossible. These men jumped knowing they'd probably never see home again. Medical care for wounded paratroopers was nearly non-existent during the critical first hours after a drop. No ambulances were driving around enemy territory picking up casualties. Medics who jumped with the units faced the same dangers as everyone else. Many wounded paratroopers died simply because help couldn't reach them in time. Communication breakdowns made everything worse. Radio equipment often broke during jumps or got separated from operators. Without reliable communication, paratroopers couldn't call for support, report their positions, or coordinate with other units. They operated blind and alone in hostile territory. The psychological pressure was intense. Unlike other soldiers who could retreat to safe positions, paratroopers were surrounded from the moment they landed. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Every sound might signal an attack. The stress of constant vigilance wore them down fast. Even successful missions came with devastating costs. Units that accomplished their objectives often suffered casualties that would have broken regular infantry formations. But while paratroopers dropped from the sky into chaos, another group of specialists was perfecting the art of death in complete secrecy. Paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines with their boots barely hitting the ground before bullets started flying. But there was another group that went even deeper into danger. Special forces weren't content with just jumping into hostile territory and fighting their way out. They had to sneak in, blow things up, steal secrets, and somehow make it home alive. These weren't your regular soldiers throwing grenades and charging forward. Special forces operated like deadly ghosts. Small teams of maybe 4 or 5 men would slip across enemy borders in the dead of night. Their job? Sabotage everything they could find and gather intelligence that could change the entire war. The British Special Operations Executive, or SOE, sent agents into Nazi-occupied Europe with one simple mission: set everything on fire. Well, not literally everything, but close enough. They targeted railway bridges, ammunition depots, communication lines, and factories producing weapons for the German war machine. One person with the right explosives could derail trains carrying thousands of enemy troops. But getting caught meant something far worse than a quick bullet to the head. The Gestapo had turned torture into an art form. They wanted names, locations, and future plans. Special Forces operatives knew that capture usually meant days or weeks of unimaginable pain before execution. Some carried suicide pills just in case. The training alone could kill you. British commandos practiced live fire exercises where real bullets whizzed inches from their heads. They learned to kill silently with knives, piano wire, or even their bare hands. Swimming in freezing water for miles, climbing cliffs in complete darkness, and memorizing entire enemy troop movements became routine. American Office of Strategic Services agents, the OSS, pulled off some of the war's most insane missions. They parachuted into occupied territories carrying fake identities, forged documents, and enough explosives to level city blocks. One wrong word in the local language could blow their cover instantly. Mispronouncing a single syllable might be the difference between completing the mission and facing a firing squad. Then there were the infiltration missions that sound like something from a spy movie. Teams would spend weeks studying enemy uniforms, learning German or Japanese military protocols, and practicing accents until they could fool native speakers. They'd walk straight into enemy bases wearing stolen uniforms, plant explosives, and casually stroll out before anyone noticed. Soviet Special Forces took things to another level entirely. Their reconnaissance troops, called razvedchiki, operated behind German lines for months at a time. They lived in forests, eating whatever they could find, and struck enemy supply convoys when least expected. Getting resupplied meant risky nighttime drops that might not come at all. Radio operators faced their own special kind of terror. They had to transmit intelligence back to headquarters while enemy direction-finding equipment tried to pinpoint their location. German radio detection teams could triangulate a transmission in minutes. Stay on the air too long, and enemy soldiers would kick down your door before you finished encoding the message. The survival rate for these missions was absolutely brutal. Some operations had less than a 30% chance of the team making it home. But the intelligence they gathered and the damage they caused often saved thousands of other soldiers' lives. Demolition work required nerves of steel and perfect timing. Setting charges on a bridge while enemy patrols walked overhead meant holding your breath and hoping nobody looked down. Too much explosive would create a fireball visible for miles. Too little, and the bridge would still be standing when enemy reinforcements arrived. Escape and evasion became a deadly game of chess played across entire countries. Special forces learned to navigate using stars, steal food without being noticed, and blend in with local populations who might turn them in for a reward. One suspicious glance from a shopkeeper could end everything. Weather added another layer of danger to already impossible missions. Parachuting into occupied territory during storms meant you might land miles from your intended drop zone. Radio equipment could fail in rain, leaving teams completely cut off from support. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes during winter operations in Eastern Europe. Some missions required staying undercover for months, living as ordinary civilians while secretly gathering intelligence or coordinating with local resistance fighters. Imagine pretending to be a French baker while secretly planning to blow up the German ammunition dump next door. One slip in your accent, one wrong reaction to a German officer's orders, and your cover would evaporate. The psychological pressure was relentless. Knowing that a single mistake could doom not just yourself but your entire team created stress that broke some of the toughest soldiers. Many Special Forces veterans never talked about their missions, even decades after the war ended. But while Special Forces chose their dangerous missions and trained extensively for them, another group of soldiers had no choice in their deadly assignments. These men faced almost certain death, not as volunteers, but as punishment for crimes both real and imagined. When Soviet commanders needed someone to die for the war effort, they knew exactly where to look. Not at their best troops, not at their most heroic volunteers. They looked at their prisons, their detention camps, and their military tribunals. What they found there became some of the most expendable soldiers in human history. These were the Strafbats, Soviet penal battalions filled with men who had committed crimes, deserted, retreated without orders, or simply said the wrong thing at the wrong time. The Soviet Union didn't waste bullets executing these men. Instead, they handed them rifles and sent them to places where death was practically guaranteed. A twisted form of recycling, if you will. The survival rates tell the whole story. While regular Soviet infantry units suffered heavy losses, penal units routinely saw casualty rates of 90% or higher. Some missions wiped out entire companies in a matter of hours. But here's the brutal logic. Every bullet that killed a penal soldier was one less bullet for the real troops behind them. Let's not forget the charming welcome these men received when joining their units. No lengthy training programs, no time to bond with fellow soldiers. Just a simple explanation, complete the mission, and maybe earn your way back to a regular unit. Die trying, and nobody would remember your name anyway. Fail to advance when ordered, and commissars would shoot you themselves. The choice was between certain death and probable death. Then there's the small matter of equipment. Regular Soviet troops often struggled with shortages of weapons and ammunition. Penal units got whatever was left over, which usually meant nothing at all. Many started battles with just their fists and whatever they could grab from fallen comrades. Some units received one rifle for every 3 men, with instructions to pick up weapons from the dead as they advanced. The missions themselves read like a manual for military suicide. Penal units cleared minefields by walking through them in organized lines. They charged machine gun nests across open ground with no artillery support. They attacked fortified positions that regular troops had already declared impossible to take. When Soviet commanders needed someone to test how strong enemy defenses really were, they sent the Strafbats to find out the hard way. But the cruelest part wasn't the missions, it was the mathematics of redemption. Soldiers could theoretically earn their way out of penal units through acts of extreme heroism, or by being wounded badly enough to prove their loyalty through blood. The catch, most heroic acts in these circumstances lasted about 30 seconds before enemy fire cut them short. And surviving long enough to get wounded required the kind of luck that very few possessed. Well, here's where things get even darker. Some penal units weren't even told what their missions were. They received orders to advance in a certain direction and keep walking until they met resistance. The real purpose was to make enemy positions reveal themselves by opening fire. Human mine detectors, essentially. The commanders back at headquarters would then mark those positions on their maps and send regular troops with proper support to actually complete the objectives. The psychological warfare was just as devastating as the physical danger. These men knew they were considered disposable by their own side. They fought alongside soldiers who might have been political prisoners one day and thieves the next. Trust was impossible when everyone knew the mission was designed to kill them all anyway. Unit cohesion existed only in the shared understanding that they were all doomed. And the weird part is how some of these men still found ways to survive. A few learned to time their movements with artillery bombardments, using the chaos to find cover. Others developed an almost supernatural ability to read battlefields and spot the safest paths through impossible situations. The ones who made it through multiple missions became legends among their own kind, ghosts who somehow kept walking through walls of bullets. Winter battles were particularly brutal for penal units. While regular troops received winter clothing and equipment, Shruffbats often faced Russian winters in whatever they were wearing when arrested. Frostbite killed as many as enemy bullets. Some men actually volunteered for the most dangerous daylight attacks just to keep moving and stay warm. The few who did survive their sentences discovered that redemption came with its own price. They returned to regular units marked by experiences that regular soldiers couldn't comprehend. Many found that surviving the unsurvivable had changed them in ways that made normal military life feel strange and distant. Makes sense, right? When your own army considers you expendable, death becomes just another work assignment. But Soviet penal units weren't the only ones facing impossible odds with inadequate equipment. On the other side of the world, young Japanese pilots were volunteering for missions that made even Shruffbat assignments look survivable by comparison. Young men strapped themselves into planes knowing they would never land again. The Japanese kamikaze pilots of World War II turned their aircraft into guided missiles, aiming for Allied ships with deadly precision. Death wasn't just a possibility for these pilots. It was the entire point of the mission. Most kamikaze pilots were barely out of their teens. The Japanese military recruited college students, factory workers, and anyone who could handle basic flight controls. Training lasted just a few weeks because complex maneuvers weren't necessary. Why teach someone to dogfight when their plane would explode on contact? The pilots learned takeoff, basic navigation, and how to aim at a moving target. Landing, that skill was completely useless. The name kamikaze came from ancient Japanese history meaning divine wind. Centuries earlier, typhoons had destroyed Mongol invasion fleets, saving Japan from conquest. Now Japanese commanders hoped their human typhoons could destroy the Allied navy. The comparison wasn't exactly flattering for the pilots, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Preparing for a kamikaze mission involved strange rituals. Pilots wrote final letters to their families knowing the words would arrive after their deaths. They received ceremonial sake and special headbands with rising sun symbols. Some commanders held elaborate farewell ceremonies complete with speeches about honor and sacrifice. The pilots posed for final photographs, smiling despite knowing these images would become their memorials. Flying a kamikaze mission required more skill than most people realize. Diving straight down at a ship sounds simple, but hitting a moving target while enemy guns fired back took real talent. Pilots had to calculate wind speed, ship direction, and their own diving angle. Miss the target, and the entire sacrifice meant nothing. Anti-aircraft fire could destroy the plane before impact, turning a purposeful death into a meaningless crash. Allied sailors learned to fear the sight of approaching Japanese planes. Regular bombing runs meant hiding and hoping to survive. Kamikaze attacks meant watching a plane deliberately aim for your exact location. The psychological impact was enormous. Knowing that someone wanted to die just to kill you created a special kind of terror that regular warfare couldn't match. The attacks worked with frightening effectiveness. Kamikaze pilots sank dozens of Allied ships and damaged hundreds more. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, and cruisers all fell victim to these human-guided bombs. A single successful hit could kill dozens of sailors and put a major warship out of action for months. The Japanese Navy couldn't build new ships fast enough, but they could build plenty of kamikaze planes. Then there were the failed missions nobody talks about. Engine problems forced some pilots to return to base, creating awkward situations for everyone involved. How do you welcome back someone who was supposed to die heroically? Some pilots tried multiple kamikaze missions before finally completing their deadly task. Others crashed into the ocean, missing their targets entirely. These failures didn't make it into the propaganda films. Many kamikaze pilots were volunteers, but volunteer had a loose definition in wartime Japan. Social pressure, military orders, and cultural expectations made refusing almost impossible. Saying no to a kamikaze mission meant dishonoring your family, your emperor, and your entire nation. Some pilots genuinely believed in their cause, while others simply couldn't find a way to say no without destroying their reputations forever. The planes themselves were often barely functional. Japan's best aircraft went to experienced pilots who might survive multiple missions. Kamikaze pilots got whatever was available, including training planes with extra bombs strapped underneath. Some planes could barely reach their targets before running out of fuel. Others had mechanical problems that killed the pilot before he could complete his mission. Allied forces developed defensive strategies specifically for kamikaze attacks. Ships traveled in tight formations, creating overlapping fields of anti-aircraft fire. Radar operators learned to distinguish between regular bombing runs and suicide attacks. Fighter pilots received orders to stop kamikaze planes at all costs, leading to some of the war's most desperate air battles. The weird part is how the attacks affected both sides psychologically. Japanese commanders saw kamikaze missions as proof of their soldiers' ultimate dedication. Allied sailors developed a grudging respect for pilots willing to die for their beliefs, even while trying to kill those same pilots. The attacks created a strange mixture of fear, admiration, and horror that regular combat couldn't produce. Weather often determined mission success more than pilot skill. Cloudy days provided cover for approaching planes but made targeting difficult. Clear skies offered perfect visibility but also gave Allied gunners better shots at incoming kamikazes. Storms could scatter entire kamikaze formations, turning coordinated attacks into individual suicide missions scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean. The final kamikaze attacks came as Allied forces approached Japan itself. Thousands of pilots prepared for one massive defensive effort that never came. Japan's surrender ended the program before these final missions could launch. But kamikaze pilots weren't the only ones facing certain death in the Pacific theater. Some soldiers never expected to fly home, but they still had to survive long enough to fight another day. When radio operators got shot and telephone lines were cut to pieces, armies had a problem. How do you tell your commander that enemy tanks are rolling toward headquarters? How do you request artillery support when your position is about to be overrun? The answer was simple but terrifying: send a runner. Messenger runners were the human version of emergency communication. These soldiers sprinted across battlefields carrying folded pieces of paper that could decide whether hundreds of men lived or died. No fancy equipment, no backup plan, just legs, lungs, and pure determination. The job sounds straightforward until you realize what crossing a battlefield actually meant. Picture this: machine gun bullets whizzing past your ears while mortar shells explode around your feet. You're holding a message that enemy snipers would love to intercept, running through mud that's often mixed with blood. Oh, and you have to do this fast because the information you're carrying has an expiration date measured in minutes. Then there's the navigation nightmare. Battlefields don't come with street signs or GPS. Runners had to memorize routes that changed constantly as explosions created new craters and destroyed old landmarks. What looked like friendly territory in the morning could be crawling with enemy soldiers by afternoon. Many runners accidentally ran straight into enemy hands, delivering their messages to the wrong army entirely. The physical demands were brutal. These men ran distances that would challenge marathon athletes, but they did it while wearing full combat gear and dodging bullets. Some runners collapsed from exhaustion before reaching their destination. Others kept running even after taking wounds that should have dropped them. British runner Albert Jacka once ran 3 miles through German artillery fire to deliver orders for a crucial attack. He made the trip twice because he wanted to confirm the message had been received correctly. The weird part: he did this while recovering from previous battle wounds that hadn't fully healed. Speed wasn't just important, it was everything. A message requesting ammunition meant nothing if it arrived after the position had already fallen. Runners developed techniques for moving faster across dangerous ground. They learned to zigzag to avoid sniper fire, time their sprints between artillery barrages, and use shell craters for temporary cover. But here's what made the job especially nerve-wracking: runners never knew what their messages contained. They might be carrying orders for a retreat that could save their units' lives, or they might be delivering intelligence about enemy movements that could turn the entire battle. The small folded paper in their pocket could be worth more than their own life. Weather made everything worse. Rain turned battlefields into muddy swamps that grabbed boots and slowed runners down. Snow made it impossible to see obstacles or enemy positions. Fog could cause runners to lose their way completely, wandering in circles while precious time ticked away. Some armies tried using dogs as messengers, but animals couldn't handle complex route changes or adapt to unexpected situations. Carrier pigeons worked sometimes, but birds got shot down or simply flew in the wrong direction. When technology failed, human runners remained the most reliable option. The psychological pressure was intense. Runners knew that entire companies might die if their message didn't get through. They also knew that carrying military communications made them high-value targets. Enemy soldiers would shoot runners on sight, and capture meant interrogation about troop movements and battle plans. Russian runners during the Battle of Stalingrad faced particularly horrific conditions. They ran through city streets filled with rubble and snipers, carrying messages between units trapped in different buildings. Many runners made multiple trips per day, each time rolling the dice with death. One American runner, in the Pacific Theater, made 17 successful message runs in a single battle. On his 18th attempt, a Japanese sniper finally got him just 50 yards from his destination. Another soldier completed the delivery, but the original runner died, knowing he'd done his job 17 times under impossible conditions. The irony was bitter. Technology that was supposed to make communication easier often made runners more necessary. Radios attracted enemy attention and needed constant maintenance. Telephone wires got cut faster than they could be repaired. The more advanced warfare became, the more armies relied on the ancient method of one person running really fast with important news. Training couldn't fully prepare anyone for the reality of crossing an active battlefield. Runners learned through experience or didn't survive long enough to learn at all. The job required split-second decision-making about routes, timing, and when to take cover versus when to keep moving. These unsung heroes of communication kept armies functioning when everything else broke down. Their willingness to risk everything for a folded piece of paper often meant the difference between victory and disaster. Speaking of taking risks in metal containers, the crews who operated the massive steel beasts of warfare faced their own unique brand of terror every single day. Looking at a World War II tank from the outside, you might think those steel beasts offered perfect protection, thick armor, powerful guns, and the ability to crush almost anything in their path. But climb inside one of those metal monsters, and you'd quickly realize the truth. Tank crews didn't ride around in safety. They operated mobile death traps that attracted every enemy weapon on the battlefield. The cramped interior of a Sherman tank barely had room for 5 men. The driver squeezed into the front hull, practically blind except for a tiny periscope. The bow gunner sat next to him, operating a machine gun through a narrow slit. Up in the turret, 3 more crew members worked in a space smaller than most closets. The commander, gunner, and loader had to coordinate perfectly while shells exploded around them and enemy rounds pinged off their armor. Well, that armor wasn't as protective as it looked. German anti-tank guns could punch through a Sherman's front plate like a can opener. When that happened, the results were horrific. Hot metal fragments ricocheted around the crew compartment at incredible speeds. Tank crews called these deadly projectiles splash. Getting hit by splash meant instant death or terrible wounds that would haunt survivors forever. Then there were the fires. Tanks carried ammunition, fuel, and hydraulic fluid, basically everything needed for a massive explosion. A single well-placed enemy round could turn a 30-ton vehicle into a blazing furnace in seconds. Crews had a grim saying, "First one out lives." The desperate scramble to escape a burning tank often meant leaving wounded buddies behind. Some tankers survived with severe burns covering most of their bodies. Others never made it to the escape hatches. The Eastern Front made tank warfare even more nightmarish. Russian winters froze crews inside their vehicles. German tank crews sometimes had to light fires under their engines just to get them started. Soviet T-34 tanks prowled the battlefield in massive numbers, hunting for lone German panzers. When Stalin's forces launched their winter offensives, entire German tank units disappeared in the snow and mud. But let's not forget the psychological pressure these crews faced daily. Tank battles weren't quick affairs. They could drag on for hours. Imagine sitting in a metal box while enemy shells constantly hammered your armor. The noise was deafening. Every impact sounded like the one that might finally break through. Some tankers went deaf from the constant explosions. Others developed nervous breakdowns that ended their military careers. Communication inside tanks was nearly impossible during combat. Crew members had to shout over the roar of the engine, the clatter of tracks, and the boom of their own gun. Radio systems frequently broke down from the constant vibration and battle damage. Tank commanders often had to stick their heads out of the turret to see what was happening, making themselves perfect targets for snipers. The weird part is how tanks attracted every type of enemy weapon imaginable. Infantry units carried special anti-tank rifles and rocket launchers specifically designed to kill tank crews. Aircraft dropped bombs and fired armor-piercing rounds from above. Artillery units adjusted their fire to hit moving targets. Even other tanks hunted in coordinated groups, trying to surround and destroy isolated vehicles. Tank crews developed superstitions that might seem silly but meant everything to them. Some refused to wash their lucky socks. Others painted names and pictures on their tanks, believing it would bring them home safely. These small rituals helped crews cope with the constant stress of knowing that each mission might be their last. Maintenance added another layer of danger to tank operations. Crews had to perform repairs and refueling, while often still under enemy fire. Changing tracks or fixing engine problems in the middle of a battlefield required incredible courage. Many tankers were killed or wounded while trying to keep their vehicles running. Different tank models had their own specific death traps. German Tiger tanks were powerful but mechanically unreliable. Soviet T-34 Cirque were tough but had poor visibility. American Shermans were reliable but under-armored compared to their German opponents. Each design forced crews to face unique risks and challenges. Recovery operations were particularly dangerous. When tanks broke down or got stuck, someone had to venture out to attach tow cables or perform emergency repairs. These missions happened under enemy observation, making rescue crews sitting ducks for artillery strikes or sniper fire. Tank crews who survived multiple battles developed an almost supernatural awareness of danger. They could tell the difference between incoming artillery and outgoing shells just by sound. They knew when to button up their hatches and when enemy infantry was getting too close. This battlefield wisdom kept some crews alive through dozens of engagements. The men who fought in these steel coffins showed incredible bravery, but even the best crews couldn't escape every threat. Those lucky enough to complete their service faced a different kind of captivity, one that would test their survival skills in ways no amount of armor could protect them from. Being captured in World War II meant your dangerous job had just begun. Millions of soldiers found themselves behind barbed wire, facing a completely different kind of deadly situation. The fighting might have stopped for them, but survival, that was about to get a whole lot harder. Prison camps weren't just places where you sat around waiting for the war to end. They were death traps disguised as temporary housing. Starvation killed more prisoners than bullets ever did. The daily food ration in many camps barely kept a person alive, sometimes just a thin soup made from potato peels and a chunk of bread that could fit in your palm. Prisoners lost so much weight that their uniforms hung like tents on walking skeletons. Disease spread through camps like wildfire in dry grass. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis turned barracks into morgues. With dozens of men crammed into spaces meant for half that number, illness jumped from person to person faster than gossip. No proper medical care meant a simple infection could become a death sentence. Guards didn't care if prisoners were dying. They had quotas to meet and mouths to feed wasn't their priority. Different camps had different rules, but most shared one thing in common. Breaking any rule meant punishment that could kill you. Some prisoners were beaten to death for stealing an extra piece of bread. Others faced execution for trying to help a sick friend. The smallest mistake, talking back to a guard, walking too slowly, or even looking the wrong way, could end your life in seconds. Winter made everything worse. Prisoners had thin clothes and no heating in most camps. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and lives. Men huddled together just to survive the night, but many didn't wake up in the morning. Spring brought different problems: mud, disease outbreaks, and the return of brutal work details that had been suspended during the coldest months. Then there were the work assignments that turned prisoners into walking dead men. Some camps forced prisoners to build their own death traps, digging mass graves or constructing crematoriums. Others sent prisoners into mines where cave-ins and poisonous gases waited around every corner. Railroad construction meant working with heavy materials and dangerous tools while guards watched for any excuse to shoot. Escape attempts, those were basically suicide missions with extra steps. Guards shot prisoners trying to climb fences, and even if someone made it over the wire, they faced hostile territory for hundreds of miles. Local populations had been told to report escaped prisoners, and many did. Recapture usually meant execution, not just for the escapee, but sometimes for their friends too. But here's what made prison camps truly terrifying: the psychological warfare. Guards played mind games that broke men faster than physical torture. They promised better treatment for information about fellow prisoners. They staged fake executions to terrorize everyone else. Some camps held selections where prisoners never knew if they were being chosen for work detail or the crematorium. Letters from home became lifelines, but they were weapons too. Guards would read personal mail out loud to humiliate prisoners, or destroy letters from loved ones just to watch hope die in a man's eyes. Many prisoners never received mail at all. Their families had no idea where they were or if they were still alive. The strange thing about survival in prison camps was how much it depended on pure luck. Being assigned to the right barracks, getting a job in the kitchen instead of the quarry, or simply not getting sick at the wrong time. These random events determined who lived and who died. Skill and bravery mattered, but luck mattered more. Some prisoners found ways to help each other survive. They shared food, nursed sick friends back to health, and formed secret networks to protect the weakest members. These acts of kindness were incredibly dangerous. Helping others could get you killed. but they happened anyway. Brotherhood became a form of resistance against a system designed to strip away humanity. Religious faith kept some prisoners alive when everything else failed. Others survived through pure stubbornness, refusing to give their captors the satisfaction of watching them die. A few even maintained their sense of humor, cracking jokes in the face of death because laughter was one of the last things guards couldn't take away. Medical experiments in some camps added another layer of horror to imprisonment. Prisoners became unwilling test subjects for procedures that were torture disguised as science. These experiments had nothing to do with helping anyone. They were just another way to kill people slowly while taking notes. Life expectancy in prison camps varied wildly depending on location, guards, and pure chance. Some prisoners lasted years, others died within weeks of arrival. The ones who survived often carried physical and mental scars for the rest of their lives. Yet even in these hellish conditions, prisoners weren't just sitting around waiting to die. Many were working jobs that would prove just as dangerous as combat itself. Being a prisoner of war was terrible enough. Then they handed you a shovel and told you to start digging. Welcome to the world of prison camp labor, where survival meant working yourself to death while staying alive just long enough to work some more. The math was simple and brutal. Feed prisoners just enough to keep them breathing, but not enough to give them strength. Work them until they collapse, then replace them with fresh captives. Repeat until the war ends or everyone dies. Guess which one happened more often? Soviet prisoners in German camps got it the worst. The Nazis considered them subhuman, which meant even less food than other prisoners. A typical daily ration, maybe 200 calories if they were lucky, that's less than a candy bar. Meanwhile, they were expected to build roads, dig trenches, or work in factories for 12 hours straight. But here's the twisted part. Some prisoners actually volunteered for the hardest jobs. Why would anyone choose to carry heavy stones or dig in frozen ground? Because the alternative was standing around in an overcrowded barracks, slowly starving to death while doing nothing. At least working gave you a tiny chance of finding extra food or proving you were useful enough to keep alive. German prisoners in Soviet camps faced their own nightmare. Stalin's gulags were already death traps for regular criminals, but war prisoners got special treatment. They built railways through frozen wilderness, cut down trees with their bare hands when tools broke, and dug canals that would freeze over before they were finished. The survival rate was so low that some German units chose to surrender to Americans instead, even when Soviets were closer. Then there were the Japanese work camps scattered across the Pacific. American prisoners of war found themselves building the Burma Railway, also known as the Death Railway. The name wasn't marketing hype. For every mile of track laid, about 300 prisoners died from disease, exhaustion, or beatings. The math was horrifying but consistent. Japanese guards had their own twisted logic. A prisoner who couldn't work was useless. A useless prisoner was wasting food. Therefore, sick prisoners should be beaten until they either got better or died quickly. Medical care meant getting back to work faster, not actually healing. Some prisoners got creative about staying alive. They learned to look busy while doing as little actual work as possible. Others discovered which guards could be bribed with cigarettes or small treasures hidden in clothing. The smart ones figured out that certain jobs like camp translator or tool repair meant working indoors and avoiding the worst punishment details. But creativity only went so far when you're eating grass soup and sleeping on frozen ground. Prisoners developed a condition called camp syndrome, where their bodies literally started consuming muscle tissue to stay alive. You could watch men shrink day by day until they looked like walking skeletons. Many prisoners weighed less than 90 pounds when they were finally liberated. The weird part is how some prisoners formed underground networks to help each other survive. They shared food, took turns doing the hardest work, and created elaborate systems for stealing supplies. Getting caught usually meant death, but the alternative was dying slowly anyway. Allied prisoners in German camps had slightly better odds, thanks to Geneva Convention protections that Germans sometimes actually followed. But even they faced brutal work assignments. Building submarine pens meant working with concrete in freezing weather. Mining coal meant descending into shafts that could collapse at any moment. Factory work meant assembling weapons that would be used against your own side. Some prisoners tried to sabotage their work assignments. They mixed sand into engine parts, built things deliberately wrong, or found ways to slow down production. It was dangerous resistance, but it felt like the only way to fight back. Getting caught meant immediate execution, but at least it was faster than starving. The psychological warfare was just as deadly as the physical labor. Guards would promise better treatment for harder work, then deliver nothing. They would separate friends, pit different nationalities against each other, and create false hope about prisoner exchanges that never came. Breaking a man's spirit was often more effective than breaking his body. Medical experiments disguised as work assignments created another level of horror. Prisoners were told they were being assigned to special medical units that turned out to be testing grounds for diseases, surgeries, and drug trials. These weren't work camps anymore, they were human laboratories where survival was never the goal. Disease spread faster than wildfire in overcrowded work camps. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis killed prisoners faster than the actual labor. Dead bodies were often left where they fell until other prisoners could drag them away during meal breaks. All prison camp laborers faced unimaginable horrors on land. Another group of brave souls was fighting a different kind of battle entirely. Their workplace was the rolling deck of a merchant ship, surrounded by miles of dark ocean filled with hidden enemies waiting to strike without warning. While tank crews and paratroopers were fighting dramatic battles on land, another group of sailors was playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek across the world's oceans. These weren't warriors hunting for glory, they were merchant sailors, naval escorts and supply ship crews running what became known as the Gauntlet, massive convoys of ships carrying everything armies needed to keep fighting. Picture hundreds of cargo ships packed with food, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies sailing together across thousands of miles of open water. Sounds safe, right? Well, lurking beneath those waves were German U-boats, Italian submarines and Japanese subs, all hunting for easy targets. One torpedo hit could send a fully loaded cargo ship to the bottom in minutes. The North Atlantic became the deadliest highway in the world. British convoys leaving for Russia faced a nightmare journey around the top of Norway. The water was so cold that falling overboard meant death in less than 10 minutes. But the cold wasn't even the worst part. German submarines formed wolf packs, groups of U-boats that coordinated attacks like hungry sharks. Convoy PQ-17 tells the whole story perfectly. This convoy started with 35 merchant ships headed to Russia in July 1942. The Admiralty got scared about German surface ships and ordered the convoy to scatter. Big mistake. Without protection, the ships became sitting ducks. Only 11 ships made it to their destination. 24 ships went down, taking 153 men and 3,350 vehicles with them. Then there's the numbers that really show how dangerous this job was. During the entire war, the Allies lost over 3,500 merchant vessels. That's roughly 175,000 sailors who never made it home. The German U-boats alone sank 2,779 Allied ships. Each sinking meant dozens of men either drowned immediately or faced the horror of floating in lifeboats for days, hoping someone would find them. Life aboard a convoy ship meant constant fear mixed with crushing boredom. Sailors spent weeks zigzagging across oceans, changing course every few minutes to avoid submarine attacks. Sleep came in short bursts, because torpedo strikes happened most often at night. Many sailors slept fully clothed with life jackets on, ready to abandon ship at a moment's notice. The Arctic convoys to Russia were particularly brutal. Temperatures dropped so low that sea spray froze instantly on deck, making every surface slippery and dangerous. Men worked with their hands exposed just long enough to handle ropes, before shoving them back into mittens. Frostbite was common. Some sailors lost fingers or toes to the cold, even before enemy action found them. What made convoy duty especially nerve-wracking was the waiting. Unlike soldiers who fought intense battles that ended quickly, convoy crews faced weeks of sustained tension. They watched the horizon constantly, knowing that a periscope or torpedo wake could appear at any second. Many developed what doctors now recognize as severe anxiety disorders, though back then they just called it war nerves. Rescue operations added another layer of danger. When a ship got torpedoed, nearby vessels had to decide whether to stop and pick up survivors or keep moving. Stopping made them perfect targets for the same submarine that just attacked. Many captains faced impossible choices: save drowning men or protect their own crew and cargo. The weapons technology made things worse. German torpedoes became more sophisticated as the war progressed. Acoustic torpedoes homed in on the sound of ship engines. Magnetic torpedoes exploded when they detected a ship's steel hull passing overhead. There was almost no defense except luck and constant vigilance. Convoy crews developed their own survival strategies. They learned to recognize the different sounds U-boats made underwater. They practiced abandoned ship drills until they could launch lifeboats in complete darkness. Some ships painted fake bow waves on their sterns to confuse submarine commanders about which direction they were traveling. The The psychological pressure was enormous. Sailors knew that statistically, their chances of surviving multiple convoy runs were getting worse with each trip, yet they kept sailing because the war effort depended on those supplies reaching their destinations. No ammunition meant no fighting, no fuel meant no planes or tanks, no food meant starving armies. Weather became both enemy and ally. Storms made sailing miserable and dangerous, but they also hid ships from submarines and made torpedo attacks nearly impossible. Many convoy commanders actually welcomed rough seas because they knew German subs couldn't operate effectively in heavy weather. Radio silence added to the isolation. Ships couldn't communicate except with signal lamps, and only when absolutely necessary. This meant that when attacks began, coordination was almost impossible. Ships often watched helplessly as vessels nearby got hit, not knowing if they should help or run. But there's something else that made convoy duty particularly deadly. Something that shows just how desperate the ocean battlefield had become. Even survival sometimes meant facing an entirely different kind of danger. While armies clashed on battlefields across Europe and the Pacific, another war raged in the shadows. This one didn't involve massive tank battles or aerial dogfights. Instead, it featured ordinary people doing extraordinary things right under the enemy's nose. Resistance fighters turned occupied territories into invisible battlegrounds where a single mistake meant torture, execution, or worse. Take the French Resistance. By 1943, over 100,000 people had joined various underground groups. That's roughly the population of a decent-sized city, all working in secret. They weren't professional soldiers either. Bakers, teachers, factory workers, and even teenagers picked up weapons and makeshift explosives. Their mission: make life hell for German occupiers through sabotage, espionage, and guerrilla warfare. But here's what made resistance work so terrifyingly dangerous. Unlike regular soldiers, resistance fighters had no uniforms, no legal protection, and no prisoner of war rights if captured. The Geneva Convention didn't apply to them. Getting caught meant immediate execution, or something much worse. The Germans developed particularly creative punishments for resistance members, often torturing them for information before killing them publicly. As examples, railway sabotage became one of their deadliest specialties. Small teams would sneak out at night to plant explosives on train tracks carrying German supplies or troops. Sounds simple, right? Wrong. These operations required perfect timing, knowledge of explosives, and nerves of steel. One resistance fighter in Norway later recalled spending 3 hours lying in snow, waiting for the perfect moment to blow up a German supply train. The slightest sound could alert nearby patrols. Then there's the math that'll give you chills. German security forces executed roughly 10 civilians for every German soldier killed by resistance fighters. This meant every successful attack triggered brutal reprisals against innocent people. Resistance members carried the weight of knowing their actions might doom their neighbors. Yet they kept fighting. Women played crucial roles that often get overlooked. They served as couriers, carrying messages and supplies between resistance cells. Why women? German soldiers were less likely to search them thoroughly. Female resistance fighters smuggled everything from ammunition to Allied airmen through enemy checkpoints. Some even seduced German officers to steal intelligence. Talk about putting your life on the line for information. The supply situation made everything worse. Resistance groups operated with whatever they could steal, buy on black markets, or receive from Allied airdrops. Weapons were scarce and often unreliable. Many fighters used homemade explosives created from fertilizer and other common materials. These improvised bombs were almost as dangerous to handle as they were to enemy targets. Communication posed another deadly puzzle. Resistance cells used coded messages transmitted through radio, underground newspapers, or simple word of mouth. Radio operators faced particular danger because German detection equipment could locate transmissions within minutes. Many operators worked knowing each broadcast might be their last. They'd set up in different locations constantly, always one step ahead of German direction-finding trucks. Age didn't matter in this shadow war. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising involved fighters as young as 13 years old. These kids carried messages, smuggled weapons, and even fought alongside adults against impossible odds. In occupied Poland, the Home Army included thousands of teenagers who conducted sabotage operations with the same deadly precision as experienced soldiers. Betrayal remained every resistance fighter's worst nightmare. German intelligence services recruited informants from local populations using bribes, threats, or blackmail. A single betrayal could destroy entire resistance networks overnight. Paranoia became a survival tool. Trust was a luxury most fighters couldn't afford. Some resistance groups achieved remarkable success despite the odds. Yugoslav partisans tied down entire German divisions that could have been used elsewhere. Greek resistance fighters destroyed bridges, ammunition dumps and communication lines with such effectiveness that German commanders complained constantly about supply disruptions. The Norwegian resistance sabotage of heavy water production facilities helped prevent Germany from developing nuclear weapons, but the human cost was staggering. In France alone, approximately 20,000 resistance fighters died during the occupation. Poland lost around 100,000 resistance members. These numbers don't include civilians executed in reprisals or family members who disappeared into concentration camps. Recovery time didn't exist for these fighters. Unlike soldiers who might rotate off front lines, resistance members lived under constant threat. Going to work, shopping for food, or visiting family all carried risks. They developed elaborate cover stories and learned to act naturally while carrying explosives or stolen intelligence documents. The psychological toll was enormous. Many resistance fighters developed what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD. They lived with constant fear, guilt over civilian casualties, and the burden of secrets they couldn't share with anyone. While resistance fighters waged their deadly shadow war across occupied Europe, another group of heroes was rushing into the most exposed positions on battlefields worldwide. These brave souls wore red crosses on their helmets, but that didn't always protect them from becoming targets themselves. When bullets start flying and bombs explode, most people run away from danger. Combat medics ran straight toward it. These brave men and women had one job that seemed almost impossible: save lives while death surrounded them on every side. Picture the chaos of a battlefield. Machine guns rattling, artillery shells screaming overhead, wounded soldiers crying for help. Now imagine someone with nothing but bandages and morphine rushing into that nightmare to drag people to safety. That was a medic's typical Tuesday. The Red Cross painted on their helmets was supposed to protect them. According to international law, shooting at medics was forbidden. But bullets don't read rulebooks. Enemy soldiers sometimes ignored these rules completely. Some medics became targets simply because they were saving enemy fighters. Others got caught in crossfire that didn't care about symbols or laws. Combat medics carried 40 pounds of medical supplies instead of extra ammunition. While other soldiers focused on killing, medics focused on the opposite. They learned to stop bleeding, treat shock, and perform emergency surgery with bombs exploding nearby. Their medical bags contained morphine, bandages, sulfur powder, and sometimes a prayer or two. The speed required was incredible. Medics had to reach wounded soldiers within minutes, or those soldiers would die. They crawled through mud, sprinted across open ground, and climbed over rubble while enemy fire peppered the area around them. Getting to someone fast often meant the difference between life and death. Then there was the weight problem. Carrying a wounded soldier on a stretcher required 2 medics minimum. Sometimes 4 were needed for rough terrain. Moving slowly with a stretcher made everyone an easy target. Medics developed techniques for dragging wounded soldiers quickly to cover, even when one medic worked alone. The psychological pressure was enormous. Every decision mattered: who to treat first when multiple soldiers were wounded, how long to spend on someone who might not survive. These split-second choices haunted many medics long after the war ended. Some medics saved dozens of lives in a single battle, only to lose sleep over the one they couldn't help. Combat medics faced unique dangers other soldiers didn't encounter. They worked in areas already hit by artillery, meaning unexploded shells could detonate at any moment. They entered bombed buildings that might collapse. They treated soldiers in minefields where one wrong step meant disaster. Training helped, but nothing really prepared medics for the reality. Medical schools don't teach you how to perform surgery while mortar shells land nearby. Textbooks don't explain how to comfort a dying 19-year-old who just wants to go home. The learning happened on the job, and mistakes had permanent consequences. Many medics earned extraordinary respect from combat soldiers. Infantry troops knew that if they got hit, a medic would risk everything to reach them. This created an unusual bond between fighters and healers. Some of the war's most decorated heroes were medics who repeatedly charged into danger to save others. The statistics tell their own story. Hundreds of medics died during World War II. Many more were wounded while treating patients. Some estimates suggest that medics had casualty rates nearly as high as frontline infantry. Their dedication to saving lives made them incredibly brave and incredibly vulnerable at the same time. Equipment made a difference, but only so much. Better medical supplies helped medics save more lives. Improved stretchers made evacuation easier, but nothing could eliminate the basic danger of working in active combat zones. Technology couldn't stop bullets or artillery fragments. Weather added another layer of difficulty. Medics worked in freezing snow, blazing heat, and torrential rain. They performed medical procedures with numb fingers in Russian winters. They treated heat stroke and dehydration in North African deserts. Mother Nature didn't pause combat operations for anyone's convenience. Some of the war's most remarkable stories involve medics who refused to carry weapons. Religious medics, particularly those from certain faiths, served as conscientious objectors. They saved lives without taking any. Many earned medals for extraordinary bravery, while never firing a shot at the enemy. The evacuation chain required perfect coordination. Field medics stabilized patients. Aid station medics provided more advanced treatment. Hospital medics performed complex surgery. Each link in this chain faced dangers, but field medics worked closest to active combat. They were the first responders in the deadliest situations imaginable. Combat medics didn't just save soldiers, they treated civilians caught in crossfire, enemy prisoners who needed medical care, and sometimes even wounded animals that soldiers had adopted as mascots. Their commitment to healing extended beyond nationality or uniform color. But medics weren't the only ones working under dangerous conditions while trying to help others survive the war. Artillery crews faced their own unique set of deadly challenges, manning the big guns that provided crucial support but made themselves massive targets in the process. After medics rushed across battlefields saving lives, another group of soldiers faced a different kind of deadly math. Artillery crews operated the biggest, loudest and most destructive weapons on any battlefield. These massive guns could hurl shells weighing hundreds of pounds across miles of territory. But here's the catch, when you're firing the biggest guns, you automatically become the biggest target. Artillery crews didn't just face enemy bullets. They faced something much worse. Every time they fired their guns, they sent up a calling card that screamed, "We're right here," to every enemy pilot, spotter, and counter-battery unit within miles. The muzzle flash from a big gun could be seen from incredible distances, especially at night. Smoke and dust clouds marked their positions like giant arrows pointing down from the sky. The work itself was back-breaking and dangerous even without enemy fire. Artillery shells were heavy, really heavy. A single shell for a large howitzer could weigh over 200 pounds. Crews had to lift, load and handle these monsters while working at incredible speed. One mistake during loading could crush a man's hand, or worse. The gun mechanisms were powerful enough to take off limbs if someone got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Then there's the noise factor that most people never consider. When a big artillery gun fired, the blast was so loud it could permanently damage hearing. Crews worked without proper ear protection, and many artillery veterans went completely deaf. The concussion from firing could knock men off their feet if they weren't braced properly. Some guns were so powerful that the blast wave could actually stop a man's heart if he was standing in the wrong spot. Enemy counter-battery fire made everything exponentially more dangerous. German artillery units became expert at locating Allied guns and returning fire within minutes. They used sound ranging, flash spotting and aerial observation to pinpoint enemy artillery positions. Once located, they would unleash devastating barrages designed to destroy both guns and crews. Artillery duels became deadly games of hide and seek, with crews racing to fire their missions and move before return fire arrived. Moving these massive weapons presented its own set of problems. Large artillery pieces weighed several tons and required specialized vehicles to transport them. Setting up a new firing position was noisy, time-consuming work that left crews exposed. They had to level the guns, dig them in for stability, and camouflage the position, all while enemy scouts might be watching. The whole process could take hours and every minute increased the risk of being spotted. Air attacks posed another constant threat. Enemy fighter planes actively hunted for artillery positions, and a single well-placed bomb or strafing run could wipe out an entire gun crew. Unlike infantry who could scatter and take cover in foxholes, artillery crews had to stay near their massive immobile weapons. When enemy planes appeared, there was nowhere to hide. Artillery ammunition dumps created additional hazards that kept everyone on edge. These storage areas contained thousands of explosive shells stacked together in one location. A direct hit on an ammunition dump would create an explosion visible for miles and deadly for anyone within hundreds of yards. Crews working near these dumps knew they were sitting on top of the world's largest firecrackers. The physical demands never let up. Artillery crews worked in shifts around the clock, especially during major offensives when fire missions came in continuously. They lifted heavy shells, operated complex mechanical systems, and performed precise calculations while exhausted. Fatigue led to accidents, and accidents around high explosives usually meant death or serious injury. Weather made everything worse. Rain turned gun positions into muddy disasters where heavy equipment could get stuck or tip over. Snow and ice made handling ammunition treacherous. Extreme cold could cause mechanical failures in the guns themselves, while extreme heat made working around the metal weapons almost unbearable. The guns had to keep firing regardless of conditions. Communication breakdowns added another layer of danger. Artillery crews depended on forward observers and radio operators to tell them where to aim and when to fire. If communications failed, crews might fire on their own troops by mistake. They also might not receive warnings about incoming enemy attacks. Many artillery positions were overrun because warning messages never got through. Some artillery crews developed ingenious methods for survival. They created dummy gun positions with fake weapons to draw enemy fire away from real positions. They used flash suppressors and careful timing to hide their muzzle flashes. The smartest crews became masters of rapid displacement, firing a few rounds and immediately moving to avoid counter-battery fire. Despite all these dangers, artillery crews knew their work often determined who won or lost battles. Their accurate fire could break enemy attacks, support friendly advances, and save countless infantry lives. The big guns demanded respect, skill, and constant vigilance from everyone who served them. But even artillery crews weren't the most targeted soldiers on the battlefield. Some weapons operators carried equipment so terrifying and distinctive that enemies would focus all their fire on eliminating them first. These specialists carried death in their hands, literally, while artillery crews stayed relatively far from enemy lines. Some soldiers had to get uncomfortably close to do their jobs. Flamethrower operators didn't have the luxury of distance. They carried death on their backs and walked straight into the most dangerous places on any battlefield. The flamethrower itself was a nightmare to carry. Most models weighed around 70 pounds when fully loaded with fuel and compressed gas. That's like strapping a medium-sized person to your back, then trying to fight a war. The fuel tanks contained a mixture of gasoline and oil that could burn at over 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel, hot enough to turn concrete bunkers into ovens. But here's where things get really dangerous. Enemy soldiers knew exactly what flamethrower operators could do to them. Nobody wanted to face that weapon, so these operators became instant priority targets the moment they appeared on any battlefield. Snipers would ignore regular infantry just to take a shot at the guy with the flame unit. Machine gunners would swing their weapons around to focus fire on flamethrower teams. The weapon had an effective range of only about 20 to 50 meters depending on the model. That meant operators had to get close enough to almost shake hands with their enemies before they could use their weapon effectively. Getting that close while carrying 70 pounds of highly flammable liquid required either incredible courage or complete insanity, probably both. Then there's the terrifying reality of what happened when those fuel tanks got hit by enemy fire. The tanks didn't always explode like in the movies, but they didn't need to. A single bullet hole could turn the operator into a human torch. The pressurized fuel would spray everywhere, coating the operator and anyone nearby. One spark and the nightmare began. Japanese flamethrower operators in the Pacific had it particularly rough. American forces quickly learned to target them first in any engagement. The thick jungle terrain meant these operators often had to get even closer to their targets, sometimes within 10 or 15 meters. At that range, enemy soldiers could practically throw grenades at them by hand. American flamethrower operators faced similar challenges in Europe. German forces developed specific tactics for dealing with them. Machine gun teams would wait for the flamethrower operator to get close, then open fire on the fuel tank specifically. German soldiers were trained to aim for the tanks, not the person carrying them. The psychological pressure was just as dangerous as the physical threats. Carrying a flamethrower meant knowing that everyone on the battlefield wanted to kill you first. Every enemy soldier, every sniper, every machine gunner had you marked as target number one. That kind of pressure could break anyone's nerve. Most flamethrower operators worked in small teams of 2 or 3 men. One carried the main weapon while others provided covering fire and protection. But even with support, survival rates were terrible. Units that used flamethrowers regularly often couldn't keep the position filled. Men would be killed or wounded faster than replacements could be trained. Training itself was dangerous. Learning to use a flamethrower meant practicing with live fire and real fuel. Accidents during training killed and injured operators before they ever saw combat. The weapon was almost as dangerous to friendly forces as it was to enemies, especially in close quarters or windy conditions. The weight and bulk of the equipment made operators slow and clumsy. They couldn't run fast, couldn't take cover quickly, and couldn't maneuver like regular infantry. Once they started an attack, they were committed. There was no quick retreat when things went wrong. Weather made everything worse. Rain could extinguish flames or make fuel tanks slippery and hard to handle. Wind could blow burning fuel back onto the operator or nearby friendly troops. Cold weather could affect fuel pressure and reduce the weapon's range even further. Despite all these dangers, flamethrowers were devastatingly effective against certain targets. Japanese bunkers in the Pacific, German pillboxes in Europe, and fortified positions everywhere fell to flamethrower attacks. The weapon could clear out defensive positions that would have taken hours to capture otherwise. Military records show that most flamethrower operators didn't survive many combat missions. The combination of being priority targets, carrying dangerous equipment and having to work at close range created a perfect storm of deadly risks. Units tried rotating the job among different soldiers, but even short assignments could be fatal. The few operators, who survived multiple missions, often suffered from severe psychological trauma. Carrying and using such a weapon, while knowing that everyone wanted to kill you first, left lasting mental scars. Many couldn't handle the stress, and had to be reassigned to other duties. But even as flamethrower operators faced these incredible dangers on land, other soldiers were preparing for missions that would make their jobs look safe by comparison. Some troops were about to face dangers that started before they even reached the battlefield. When most people think of D-Day, they picture heroic soldiers charging across beaches toward victory. What they don't see is the absolute carnage that happened in those first few minutes. Amphibious assault troops didn't just face the enemy, they faced drowning before they even reached the sand. The landing craft themselves were death traps waiting to happen. These boats weren't designed for comfort or safety. They were floating boxes meant to dump soldiers onto hostile beaches as quickly as possible. Rough seas could flip them over in seconds. Engine failures meant sitting ducks for enemy artillery. Some craft never even made it to shore, taking entire units down with them into the freezing water. But surviving the boat ride was just the beginning of the nightmare. Picture stepping off a landing craft into chest-deep water, while machine guns rake the beach ahead of you. Your gear weighs you down like concrete blocks. The soldier next to you disappears under the waves, hit by enemy fire. Another one ahead stumbles on barbed wire, hidden beneath the surface. You're not even on dry land yet, and half your unit is already gone. At Omaha Beach during D-Day, the first wave of American troops faced a slaughter that almost ended the invasion before it started. German machine gun nests had perfect fields of fire. Every step forward meant stepping over the bodies of soldiers who'd tried the same thing minutes before. Some units lost 90% of their men in the first hour. The beach turned red with blood, and wounded soldiers drowned in the incoming tide. Then there's the problem nobody talks about: the equipment failures. Waterproof radios that weren't actually waterproof. Weapons clogged with sand and salt water. Tanks that sank like stones when dropped too far from shore. The D.D. Sherman tanks at D-Day were supposed to provide fire support, but most of them ended up on the ocean floor instead. Their crews had seconds to escape before tons of steel dragged them down. Enemy mines made every step a gamble with death. Beach obstacles weren't just barriers. They were explosive traps designed to shred landing craft and the men inside them. German engineers had months to prepare these killing fields. They knew exactly where the Allies would land, and they'd turned those beaches into carefully planned slaughterhouses. What made amphibious assaults especially deadly was the complete lack of cover. On a regular battlefield, soldiers could dive into foxholes or hide behind trees. Beach assault troops had nothing but open sand and enemy fire. The lucky ones found dead bodies to crouch behind. The unlucky ones became someone else's cover. Communication broke down almost immediately during these landings. Officers were usually the first targets, leaving units without leadership or direction. Radio operators couldn't get their equipment working in the surf. Units that were supposed to land together got scattered across miles of coastline. Small groups of soldiers found themselves fighting alone against prepared enemy positions. Medical care was nearly impossible during the initial assault. Medics couldn't reach wounded soldiers pinned down by machine gun fire. Evacuation meant dragging casualties back through the same deadly gauntlet they'd just survived. Many wounded soldiers simply bled out on the sand, while the battle raged around them. The psychological toll was just as brutal as the physical danger. Imagine watching your friends get torn apart by machine gun fire, while you're still waist-deep in water. Some soldiers broke down completely, unable to move forward or back. Others kept fighting in a kind of shocked trance, not really understanding what was happening around them. Pacific Theater amphibious assaults brought their own special horrors. Japanese defenders often fought to the last man, turning every pillbox and cave into a death trap. Iwo Jima and Okinawa became meat grinders that consumed entire units. The Japanese knew they couldn't win these battles, so they focused on killing as many Americans as possible before dying themselves. Weather could turn a difficult landing into an impossible one. High waves swamped landing craft. Strong currents pushed boats off course into heavily defended areas. Low clouds meant no air support when it was needed most. Some assaults were postponed multiple times, leaving troops seasick and exhausted before they even reached the enemy. But here's what's really remarkable. These men kept going anyway. They climbed over the bodies of their friends and charged machine gun nests with nothing but rifles and grenades. They cleared obstacles under fire and established footholds on beaches that seemed impossible to take. The casualty rates were horrific, but somehow, they made it work. The success of these operations often came down to individual acts of heroism by soldiers who had every reason to run away. Small groups would knock out machine gun nests or clear paths through minefields, allowing others to follow. These weren't grand strategic moves. They were desperate acts by scared men who refused to quit. Even after surviving the beach assault, these troops faced weeks of fighting in unfamiliar territory with limited supplies. But first they had to make it off that deadly sand alive. And speaking of survival in impossible conditions, there were specialists working right behind enemy lines who faced their own unique challenges with explosive devices that could level entire city blocks. After the bombers flew away and the sirens stopped wailing, another kind of danger began. Hidden beneath the rubble of bombed cities, unexploded bombs waited like deadly surprises. These weren't duds that failed to work. They were delayed action bombs designed to explode hours or even days after impact. The German Luftwaffe dropped thousands of these time bombs on British cities during the Blitz. Their twisted logic was simple: make people afraid to return home, even after the air raid ended. But someone had to deal with these ticking death traps buried under collapsed buildings and crater-filled streets. Enter the bomb disposal units. These weren't soldiers trained for battlefield combat. Most were regular folks who learned on the job. Engineers, mechanics, even office workers volunteered for this terrifying work. Why would anyone sign up to crawl into dark holes and fiddle with explosives? Well, someone had to do it. The work started immediately after air raids ended. Teams would scan bombed areas, looking for suspicious craters or reports from civilians who heard something land but never heard it explode. Finding the bombs was just the beginning of their problems. These weren't simple grenades you could just carry away. German delayed action bombs weighed hundreds of pounds. Some were buried 20 feet deep in soft ground. Others had punched through building foundations and sat wedged between twisted metal pipes and broken concrete. Getting to them required hours of careful digging, often by hand. But here's where things got really nasty. The Germans kept changing their fuse designs to stay ahead of British disposal techniques. Just when teams figured out how to safely remove one type of fuse, the enemy would switch to a completely different mechanism. Some bombs had anti-handling devices that would trigger if moved too quickly. Others had multiple fuses as backup systems. The most feared were the ones with motion-sensitive triggers. Even the vibration from nearby footsteps could set them off. Teams had to work in complete silence, using hand signals to communicate. One disposal expert described the work as performing surgery on a patient who might explode if you sneezed. Then there were the really clever German innovations. Some bombs had magnetic switches that activated when metal tools got too close. Others had pressure-sensitive plates that would detonate if the atmospheric pressure changed suddenly. The Germans even designed fuses that would arm themselves only after sitting undisturbed for several hours, making them impossible to defuse immediately. Working conditions made everything worse. Most unexploded bombs were found in basements or underground areas. Teams worked by flashlight in cramped spaces, often with water dripping around them. The air was thick with dust and the smell of cordite, and they never knew if the building above might collapse while they worked. Lieutenant Stuart Archer became famous for defusing a massive bomb that landed next to St. Paul's Cathedral in London. The bomb had buried itself 27 feet deep and threatened to destroy the historic building. Archer spent 3 days digging down to reach it, knowing that one wrong move would not only kill him but bring down one of London's most important landmarks. The psychological pressure was enormous. These teams knew that hundreds of people had evacuated their homes and were waiting to return. Entire city blocks remained empty until the bombs could be removed or safely detonated. The longer it took, the more lives were disrupted. Success rates were surprisingly high, but failures were catastrophic. When a bomb disposal went wrong, it usually meant the entire team died instantly. There were no second chances and no room for learning from mistakes. Teams that made errors simply vanished in massive explosions. Some bombs couldn't be defused safely and had to be detonated in place. This meant destroying whatever buildings were nearby, but it was better than leaving a ticking time bomb in the middle of a neighborhood. These controlled explosions created even more rubble and damage, but at least people could return to pick up the pieces. The work continued around the clock. As soon as one bomb was dealt with, reports would come in about another suspicious crater across town. Some disposal experts defused dozens of bombs during the war. Others lasted only a few days before their luck ran out. What made these people so brave? Most said they weren't heroes at all. They were just ordinary people who saw a job that needed doing. Their neighbors couldn't sleep safely knowing unexploded bombs sat beneath their streets. Schools couldn't reopen. Hospitals couldn't function. And normal life couldn't return until someone removed these hidden threats. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. While soldiers fought battles thousands of miles away, these quiet heroes fought their own war in the bombed-out neighborhoods of home. But even as disposal units worked to clear the cities, other dangerous jobs continued in support roles that kept armies functioning. Most people think support crews had safe jobs during World War II. They couldn't be more wrong. Field cooks stirring soup while artillery shells screamed overhead. Supply clerks counting ammunition as enemy planes dove toward their positions. These weren't desk jobs. They were death traps with aprons and clipboards. The smell of bacon frying mixed with cordite from nearby explosions became normal for field kitchens. Cooks worked just 50 meters behind front lines, close enough to hear enemy soldiers shouting, "Why so close?" Simple logistics. Hot food had to reach hungry soldiers before it turned cold. Cold food meant low morale, and low morale meant lost battles. But here's the twisted part. Enemy forces specifically targeted support areas. They knew destroying kitchens and supply dumps would cripple entire divisions faster than direct combat. Japanese artillery crews during the Pacific Campaign made sport of hitting Allied mess tents during dinner hours. Maximum chaos, maximum psychological damage. Field cooks carried rifles alongside their ladles for good reason. When attacks came, they dropped everything and fought. During the Battle of the Bulge, an entire cooking unit held off German infantry for 3 hours using nothing but hunting rifles and leftover grenades from supply runs. Half the cooks died that day, but they kept a crucial supply route open. Then there's the story of Sergeant Tommy Martinez, head cook for the 82nd Airborne. His mobile kitchen took shrapnel during a morning bombardment in Italy. Instead of retreating, Martinez kept cooking with a bandaged head and one working arm. He served hot meals to over 200 paratroopers while medics treated wounded soldiers 10 feet away. Martinez survived the war, but lost hearing in his left ear from constant shell explosions. Supply runners faced even worse odds than cooks. They carried ammunition, medical supplies and mail through active combat zones multiple times daily. These weren't armored vehicles making supply runs. Most were teenagers with backpacks and bicycles racing between foxholes and bunkers. Radio operators supporting frontline units became priority targets for enemy snipers. Their antennas gave away positions immediately. Soviet radio operators on the Eastern Front had life expectancies measured in days, not weeks. German marksmen knew that killing one radio operator could silence an entire company's communication with headquarters. Medical orderlies technically weren't supposed to fight, but nobody told the enemy. They carried stretchers across open ground while machine guns swept the area. Many dropped medical supplies and grabbed weapons when their positions got overrun. The Geneva Convention meant nothing when survival was at stake. Vehicle mechanics worked under constant pressure, knowing that one broken truck could strand an entire unit. They repaired engines while bullets ricocheted off metal. Welding sparks attracted enemy fire like magnets. Many mechanics died underneath vehicles they were desperately trying to fix before enemy forces arrived. Mail clerks risked their lives delivering letters from home. Sounds silly until you realize mail runs happened regardless of combat conditions. Soldiers needed those letters to maintain sanity. Mail clerks drove unarmored jeeps through contested territory, carrying bags of hope and bad news from families thousands of miles away. The weirdest danger came from friendly fire. Support crews often worked in areas where multiple units operated without clear communication. Allied artillery sometimes shelled their own supply positions by mistake. Air support occasionally strafed friendly kitchens and supply dumps. Blue-on-blue incidents killed more support personnel than most people realize. Supply drops created their own nightmare scenarios. Cargo planes dropped food and ammunition in contested areas where support crews had to retrieve supplies under enemy observation. Many supplies landed in no man's land, requiring dangerous recovery missions that felt more like suicide runs than logistics operations. Weather made everything worse for outdoor support operations. Cooking in monsoon rains while Japanese forces attacked supply lines in Burma. Maintaining equipment in Russian winters where metal became so cold it burned exposed skin. Desert operations where supply trucks broke down in sandstorms with enemy patrols nearby. Some support crews developed incredible survival instincts. They learned to identify incoming artillery by sound alone. Different whistles meant different shell types and impact zones. Experienced field cooks could estimate explosion distances within meters just by listening. These skills separated veterans from casualties. The psychological toll was brutal. Support crews watched wounded soldiers arrive for treatment while trying to maintain normal operations. They served meals to men who might die in the next attack. They processed personal effects of dead soldiers while enemy forces prepared their next assault. Statistics tell the real story. Support units in active combat zones suffered casualty rates approaching 30%, higher than many frontline infantry units. The myth of safe rear area jobs died quickly when bullets started flying. These men and women kept armies functioning while facing the same mortal dangers as combat soldiers. While support crews struggled to keep armies fed and supplied under fire, other specialized units faced different but equally deadly challenges. Some pilots drew the most dangerous assignments of all, flying directly into nature's most violent storms to gather weather information that could change entire campaigns. While most World War II pilots were busy dodging enemy bullets and anti-aircraft fire, a special group of aviators faced an entirely different kind of enemy. These weather reconnaissance pilots flew straight into the heart of nature's most violent storms, armed with nothing but fragile instruments and sheer determination. Their mission? Gather meteorological data that could make or break entire military operations. Weather might seem like a minor detail compared to tanks and bombs, but it determined everything in wartime. D-Day almost got postponed because of storm predictions. Air raids depended on clear skies. Naval battles required knowledge of wind patterns and wave heights. Someone had to fly into hurricanes, blizzards, and thunderstorms to get this information. That someone usually didn't come back. The planes these pilots used weren't built for storm hunting. Most were modified bombers or transport aircraft, stripped of weapons to make room for weather equipment. Barometers, thermometers, and primitive radio transmitters replaced machine guns and armor plating. Makes sense, right? Wrong. These pilots were flying into conditions that could tear apart heavily armored fighters, and they were doing it in aircraft that were essentially flying weather stations. Hurricane hunting became particularly deadly in the Pacific Theater. Japanese and American forces both needed to know when massive storms would hit their fleets. Typhoons could sink entire naval groups faster than any enemy attack. Weather recon pilots would fly directly into these rotating walls of destruction, taking measurements while their aircraft got tossed around like paper airplanes. The turbulence was so violent that pilots often blacked out from the G-forces. Many never regained consciousness. But here's the weird part. Some of the most dangerous flights happened over seemingly peaceful areas. Arctic weather reconnaissance required pilots to fly over the North Atlantic in winter, where temperatures dropped so low that aircraft engines would freeze mid-flight. Ice would form on the wings, making the planes too heavy to stay airborne. Radio equipment would fail in the extreme cold, leaving pilots completely cut off from base. Search and rescue operations were nearly impossible in these conditions. Then there were the lightning storms. Flying into electrical storms meant getting hit by lightning strikes repeatedly during a single mission. The metal aircraft acted like giant lightning rods, attracting every bolt in the area. While modern planes can handle lightning strikes, World War II aircraft often had their electrical systems completely fried. Pilots would find themselves flying blind with no instruments, no radio, and no way to navigate home. The pressure to get accurate weather data created impossible situations. Military commanders demanded forecasts with pinpoint accuracy, but weather patterns could change completely in the time it took to fly a reconnaissance mission. Pilots might fly into what looked like a mild storm, only to discover they'd entered a weather system that had intensified into something far more dangerous. Escape wasn't always an option once you were inside. Navigation presented its own deadly challenges. Weather fronts could stretch for hundreds of miles, and once inside a storm, pilots lost all visual references. Compasses would spin wildly during electrical storms. Radio beacons were useless through heavy precipitation. Some pilots spent hours flying in circles, burning through their fuel while trying to find a way out of massive cloud systems that seemed to have no end. Let's not forget the human factor in all this chaos. These weren't short flights around the local airfield. Weather reconnaissance missions could last 8 to 12 hours, with pilots fighting to control their aircraft through continuous turbulence the entire time. Physical exhaustion became as dangerous as the weather itself. Tired pilots made mistakes, and mistakes at 30,000 feet inside a thunderstorm were usually fatal. The intelligence gathered from these flights changed the course of major battles. Accurate weather forecasts allowed commanders to time amphibious assaults when seas would be calm enough for landing craft. Air raid planners used storm data to find cloud cover that would hide bomber formations. Naval commanders routed their fleets around typhoons that could have destroyed entire task forces. Weather data was so valuable that both sides tried to capture enemy meteorologists and their equipment. Weather stations in remote locations became high-priority military targets. The information gathered by weather reconnaissance pilots was often classified at the highest levels, treated like the most sensitive intelligence reports. A single weather forecast could reveal planned military operations to enemy forces. Some weather recon pilots developed an almost supernatural ability to read atmospheric conditions. They could feel changes in air pressure through the aircraft's behavior, predict wind shifts by watching cloud formations, and navigate through storms using subtle changes in turbulence patterns. This knowledge came at a price. Most pilots who survived long enough to develop these skills had already lost multiple crew members to weather-related crashes. The storms didn't discriminate between friend and enemy. Weather reconnaissance was one of the few jobs where the primary threat came from nature rather than enemy action. But the information these pilots gathered would soon prove just as crucial for those who faced a different kind of danger: the war correspondents who risked everything to bring the truth from battlefields to the world. While soldiers fought with guns and pilots dropped bombs, another group of people faced death with nothing but notebooks and cameras. War correspondents rushed toward danger while everyone else ran away. Their job? Get the story and somehow stay alive long enough to tell it. These weren't your typical desk journalists typing safely in newsrooms. War correspondents lived in trenches, rode in tanks, and jumped out of planes with paratroopers. They ate the same terrible food as soldiers, slept in the same muddy foxholes, and dodged the same bullets. The only difference: soldiers carried rifles, correspondents carried typewriters. Ernie Pyle became America's most famous war correspondent by writing about ordinary soldiers doing extraordinary things. He lived with infantry units for months, sharing their dangers and telling their stories. Pyle survived campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France. Then, in April 1945, just months before the war ended, a Japanese sniper's bullet killed him on a tiny Pacific island. His final column was found in his pocket, unfinished. The numbers tell a grim story. Over 200 war correspondents died during World War II. Many more were wounded, captured, or simply disappeared. They faced the same artillery barrages as soldiers, but without military training or proper equipment. Some correspondents wore helmets and carried first aid kits. Others just showed up with press badges and hope. Margaret Bourke-White, one of the first female war correspondents, flew on bombing missions over Germany. She crammed into B-17 flying fortresses alongside nervous air crews, photographing their faces before dangerous raids. During one mission, her bomber barely made it back to base, riddled with holes from German fighters. She kept taking pictures even as the plane shook apart around her. Then there were correspondents who went behind enemy lines with special forces. They parachuted into occupied territories, lived with resistance fighters, and witnessed secret operations that wouldn't be declassified for decades. Getting caught meant torture and execution. Their press credentials wouldn't save them from firing squads. Radio correspondents faced unique challenges. Edward R. Murrow broadcast live from London during the Blitz, describing German bombs falling around him as he spoke into his microphone. His voice shook from explosions, not fear. Well, maybe a little fear. Listeners back home heard air raid sirens and anti-aircraft guns in the background, bringing the war into American living rooms for the first time. Some correspondents became prisoners of war themselves. They endured the same starvation and brutal treatment as captured soldiers. A few managed to keep writing in secret, smuggling out stories about prison camp conditions. Others spent years in captivity, their families unsure if they were dead or alive. The weird part is how many correspondents volunteered for the most dangerous assignments. When generals planned risky operations, journalists literally fought each other for permission to tag along. D-Day landings. Correspondents waded ashore with the first wave of troops. Market Garden. They jumped with paratroopers. Iwo Jima. They climbed those bloody beaches carrying cameras instead of weapons. Technology made their jobs even harder. No internet, no satellite phones, no instant communication. Correspondents wrote their stories by hand, then found ways to get them back to their newspapers. Sometimes they gave articles to wounded soldiers being evacuated. Other times they trusted strangers to carry their reports across war zones. Many stories never made it home at all. Female correspondents faced extra obstacles. Military commanders didn't want women near combat zones. Martha Gellhorn, one of the greatest war correspondents ever, had to sneak aboard a hospital ship to cover D-Day because officials refused her permission. She was arrested afterward, but got her story. Her motto? I followed wars around like other people follow baseball teams. The psychological toll was enormous. Correspondents witnessed unspeakable horrors, then had to write about them clearly and objectively. They saw friends die, cities destroyed, and civilians murdered. Many suffered what we now call PTSD, though nobody understood it then. Some never fully recovered from what they experienced, but their work changed everything. Newspaper readers and radio listeners back home finally understood what war really looked like. No more romantic notions about glorious battles. Correspondents showed the mud, blood, and terror of real combat. Their stories influenced public opinion, government policy, and military strategy. The strangest part, many correspondents became addicted to the danger. After covering one war, they'd immediately volunteer for the next conflict. Some spent their entire careers jumping from battle to battle, unable to adjust to peacetime journalism. Peace was too quiet, too boring after experiencing the ultimate deadline pressure of wartime reporting. These journalists knew their stories might be their last. They wrote with desperate urgency, knowing that tomorrow they might be the story instead of covering it. Their courage brought truth from the darkest places on Earth, one typewriter key at a time. While correspondents risked everything to tell these stories, other unsung heroes faced equally dangerous missions in the skies above battlefields, carrying hope instead of headlines to desperate soldiers below. When soldiers were trapped behind enemy lines with no food, ammunition running low, and enemy forces closing in, there was only one hope left: supply drops from the sky. These weren't just packages falling from planes. They were lifelines delivered by crews who flew straight into danger zones where getting shot down meant certain death. The job looked simple enough on paper. Load up a transport plane with supplies, fly over the drop zone, push everything out the back, and head home. Reality? Flying low and slow over areas crawling with enemy fighters and anti-aircraft guns while trying to hit a target the size of a football field. Oh, and doing it while people below were actively shooting at you. Transport planes like the C-47 Dakota became flying targets the moment they entered contested airspace. These aircraft had virtually no armor and no defensive weapons worth mentioning. They relied entirely on speed and luck, except they couldn't fly fast when making precision drops. Pilots had to slow down, drop altitude, and hold steady courses that made them sitting ducks for enemy gunners. Drop zone accuracy meant everything. Miss by a few hundred yards, and those desperately needed medical supplies might land in enemy hands instead. Or worse, food drops could end up in a minefield where nobody could retrieve them. Aircrew members spent countless hours studying maps, calculating wind speeds, and timing their releases down to the second. One miscalculation and weeks of planning went to waste. Weather turned these missions into nightmares. Strong winds could scatter parachuted supplies across miles of territory. Thick clouds meant flying blind while trying to locate tiny drop zones marked only by signal fires or colored panels. Storm systems forced planes off course, sometimes directly over enemy positions they were supposed to avoid. Many crews never made it back simply because they got lost in bad weather and ran out of fuel. Anti-aircraft fire created deadly light shows around transport aircraft. German 88mm guns could tear apart a slow-moving transport plane with just a few direct hits. Crews described flying through walls of exploding metal while praying their cargo of ammunition wouldn't detonate if hit by shrapnel. Some pilots developed techniques for rapid altitude changes during drops, diving away immediately after release to avoid the worst of the ground fire. Then there were the fighter attacks. Enemy pilots knew exactly when and where supply drops were most likely to occur. They waited like hawks, ready to pounce on lumbering transport planes that couldn't fight back effectively. Many supply missions turned into desperate chases across enemy territory, with transport crews pushing their engines to maximum power while enemy fighters closed in from behind. Loading the aircraft presented its own deadly challenges. Ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies had to be carefully balanced to prevent the plane from becoming unstable during flight. Heavy items needed proper securing or they could shift during flight and send the aircraft into an uncontrollable spin. More than one supply plane crashed simply because cargo broke loose during turbulence and shifted the center of gravity. Parachute failures added another layer of risk. Supply bundles that didn't deploy properly became deadly projectiles, potentially killing the very people they were meant to help. Aircrews had to inspect every parachute and double-check every attachment point, knowing that their friends on the ground were counting on these supplies to stay alive. The pressure was enormous. Night drops multiplied every danger by 10. Flying in complete darkness over unfamiliar territory while trying to locate small drop zones marked by brief signal lights required incredible skill and nerves of steel. Enemy searchlights could blind pilots at critical moments while night fighters attacked without warning from the darkness. Navigation became guesswork when landmarks disappeared in the black. Some of the most dangerous drops happened during major battles. The siege of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge saw transport crews flying through active combat zones where artillery shells exploded around them in midair. Planes limped back to base with massive damage, some barely making emergency landings with dead or wounded crew members. Radio silence made everything worse. Supply crews often couldn't communicate with ground forces to confirm drop zone conditions or enemy activity. They flew into situations blind, never knowing if the landing zone was still in friendly hands or had been overrun by enemy forces. Some crews dropped supplies directly to enemy troops by mistake. Mechanical failures during supply missions usually meant death for everyone aboard. Emergency landings in enemy territory meant capture at best, execution at worst. Engine problems while carrying explosive cargo created impossible choices: try to make it back to base and risk blowing up in flight, or crash land and hope the ammunition didn't detonate on impact. But here's what made these crews truly remarkable: they kept flying these missions even when the odds were stacked against them, because somewhere below, soldiers and civilians were depending on those supplies to survive another day. Speaking of survival, the people who made these dangerous drops possible weren't just the aircrew members risking their lives in the sky. Speaking different languages during wartime wasn't just about communication, it was about survival. When bullets are flying and lives hang in the back, the person translating between enemies holds everyone's fate in their hands. One wrong word could start a massacre. One misunderstood phrase could doom an entire unit. Interpreters in World War II faced a nightmare that most soldiers never experienced. They weren't just caught between armies, they were caught between worlds. Their own side didn't fully trust them because they spoke the enemy's language. The enemy didn't trust them because, well, they were the enemy, and everyone in between. They depended on these interpreters to get things right, even when getting things right might be impossible. Consider the chaos of a battlefield interrogation. A captured German soldier sits bleeding in a makeshift tent. American officers need information about enemy positions, and they need it fast. The interpreter has minutes, maybe seconds, to get accurate details while shells explode nearby. But here's the twist: what if the prisoner is lying? What if he's giving false coordinates that will send Allied troops into a trap? The interpreter has to figure out truth from deception, all while translating under extreme pressure. The weird part is how many interpreters were former refugees or immigrants. German Americans translated for interrogations of Nazi prisoners. Japanese Americans, many whose own families were locked in internment camps, worked as interpreters in the Pacific Theater. Talk about complicated loyalty. These men and women had to separate their personal feelings from their deadly important work. Then there's the technical nightmare of military translation. Military terms don't always have direct translations. German tank classifications, Japanese naval codes, Soviet artillery commands. Interpreters had to become experts in weapons, tactics, and military structure for multiple armies. A mistake about tank types could mean sending infantry against heavy armor instead of light reconnaissance vehicles. That's not just embarrassing, it's lethal. Interrogation interpreters faced particularly brutal psychological pressure. Nazi SS officers were trained to resist questioning, and often tried to manipulate interpreters. They'd speak in regional dialects, use code words, or deliberately give confusing information. Some would try to convert interpreters to their cause, while others would threaten their families back in occupied territories. The mental strain broke many interpreters who couldn't handle being psychological battlegrounds. Let's not forget the interpreters working in occupied territories with resistance groups. These people were essentially triple agents. They had to maintain cover identities with occupying forces, while secretly working with underground fighters. If discovered, they faced torture and execution. But their work was crucial. They intercepted enemy communications, translated captured documents, and helped plan sabotage operations. Field interpreters attached to combat units had their own special hell. They went on patrols, participated in raids, and translated during active firefights. Imagine trying to accurately translate a surrender while machine guns are chattering nearby. Enemy soldiers shouting "Kamerad" or "surrender" might actually be calling for backup or warning their comrades. The interpreter has split seconds to determine intent while staying alive. Prisoner of war camps created another dangerous category of interpreter work. Both sides used interpreters to manage prison populations, investigate escape attempts, and process new prisoners. These interpreters often faced revenge from prisoners who blamed them for their captivity. Camp interpreters also had to navigate the complex politics between different prisoner groups: German regulars versus SS, political prisoners versus common criminals. Radio intercept interpreters worked in a different but equally dangerous environment. They listened to enemy communications around the clock, translating coded messages and military orders. The work was mentally exhausting and critically important. Misinterpreting enemy attack plans could doom thousands of soldiers. These interpreters worked in teams, double-checking each other's translations because the stakes were so incredibly high. The most dangerous interpreter jobs involved diplomatic negotiations and surrender talks. When armies wanted to negotiate temporary truces, prisoner exchanges, or surrender terms, interpreters became the crucial link. But these meetings were often traps or ambushes. Interpreters attending surrender negotiations never knew if they'd be shot as soon as the talking stopped. Medical interpreters faced unique emotional challenges. They translated between wounded prisoners and Allied medical staff. Dying soldiers often confessed secrets, begged for messages to be sent home, or provided intelligence in exchange for medical care. These interpreters had to balance professional duty with human compassion, often becoming the last person enemy soldiers spoke to before dying. Many interpreters suffered psychological breakdowns from the constant stress and moral complexity of their work. They witnessed interrogations, torture, and executions while maintaining professional detachment. The mental toll was enormous, and many developed what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD. Some interpreters switched sides during the war, either by choice or under duress. This created an atmosphere of suspicion that made their already dangerous jobs even more perilous. Both sides monitored their interpreters constantly, watching for signs of divided loyalty or enemy influence. But while interpreters navigated the complex world of human communication and trust, another group of wartime workers dealt with dangers that remained deadly long after the fighting stopped. When the guns finally went silent in 1945, millions celebrated. Victory parades filled the streets. Soldiers hugged their families. The nightmare was over, right? Well, not exactly. World War II left behind invisible killers that would claim lives for decades to come. The war's deadliest jobs didn't end with peace treaties. Hidden beneath European soil lay millions of unexploded bombs and landmines. These weren't just forgotten relics. They were ticking time bombs waiting for someone to make the wrong step. Every farmer plowing his field faced potential death. Construction workers digging foundations played Russian roulette with every shovelful of dirt. Children found strange metal objects while playing in the woods, not knowing they held enough explosive power to level a house. The numbers are staggering. In France alone, over 12 million tons of unexploded ammunition still lurks underground. That's more explosive material than was dropped during the entire London Blitz. Germany has cleared roughly 1.5 million bombs since the war ended, yet experts estimate another 100,000 remain buried. Makes you wonder what's really under your feet when you walk through those old European cities, doesn't it? Then there's the human cost that keeps climbing. Post-war cleanup crews developed into their own breed of daredevils. These bomb disposal experts crawl into basements, dig through rubble, and carefully extract devices that have been aging like dangerous wine for 8 decades. The older these explosives get, the more unstable they become. Chemical deterioration makes them even more unpredictable than when they were first dropped. But here's the twisted part. Sometimes the cleanup is more dangerous than the original war. In 2017, a 500-pound British bomb discovered in Hanover, Germany forced the evacuation of 50,000 people. The bomb squad worked for hours, knowing that one wrong move could create a crater the size of a city block. These specialists face the same life-or-death decisions that wartime engineers confronted, except now they're working with explosives that have had 7 decades to become temperamental. Let's not forget the farmers who became accidental soldiers in peacetime. Belgian and French farmers still uncover artillery shells during spring ploughing. They call it the iron harvest, a grim joke about deadly crops that keep sprouting from the earth. Some farmers have found so many shells over the years that they keep special collection points at the edges of their fields. The local authorities pick them up like a twisted version of Garbage Day. The ocean presents its own set of nightmares. Millions of naval mines were scattered across shipping lanes during the war. Many broke free from their anchors and drifted for years, turning up on beaches decades later. Fishermen still occasionally drag up unexploded torpedoes in their nets. Imagine the surprise of pulling up what you think is a big catch, only to find a device capable of sinking your entire boat. Even more bizarre are the chemical weapons dumps. After the war, nobody quite knew what to do with all the poison gas and chemical ammunition. The solution? Dump it in the ocean. The North Sea and Baltic Sea became underwater graveyards for chemical weapons. Now, as these containers corrode on the seafloor, they're leaking their deadly contents. Fish in some areas show chemical burns. Commercial fishing boats occasionally bring up corroded shells that release toxic clouds when exposed to air. Modern construction projects have turned into archaeological expeditions through explosive history. When London digs new subway tunnels, workers know they might uncover unexploded Luftwaffe bombs. Building the new Berlin airport required clearing thousands of bombs and artillery shells. Construction crews need specialized training to recognize dangerous objects. One construction company in Germany estimates that bomb disposal adds 15% to their project costs. The psychological toll on cleanup crews rivals what combat soldiers experienced. These specialists know that each device they approach could be their last. They develop the same dark humor and tight bonds that characterized wartime units. Some describe the work as addictive, the ultimate high-stakes puzzle where failure means instant death. Technology has improved the odds, but danger remains constant. Ground-penetrating radar can detect metal objects, but can't always distinguish between a harmless pipe and a 1,000-pound bomb. Robotic disposal systems help maintain safe distances, yet someone still needs to make the final approach. The job requires the same steady nerves and precise movements that defined the most dangerous wartime occupations. What's truly unsettling is how long this cleanup will continue. Experts predict that unexploded ordnance will keep surfacing for at least another century. Children born today might still be dealing with Hitler's bombs when they're grandparents. The war that ended in 1945 continues claiming victims in 2024. This deadly legacy proves that warfare's most dangerous jobs don't respect peace treaties. While we remember the heroes who served in combat, we should also recognize those who still risk everything to clean up war's mess. Their courage connects directly to the bravest souls who faced impossible odds when the world burned with conflict.